Greetings friends, and welcome back to our archives. Tales of the Jedi has given us the long-awaited personal look at Dooku's journey to the dark side in canon. While we have had novels such as Dooku Jedi Lost that explains it quite well, I believe that Filoni and the team has given us something absolutely incredible with each of these shorts perfectly depicting Dooku as a character, and as a character that we have never seen him before. For this video, we wanted to do a deep character dive, exclusively talking all about Dooku and his many layers. I believe Dooku to be one of the most complex characters in all of Star Wars and its main cast. From his appearance in Attack of the Clones and every subsequent appearance through the Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith, Dooku manages to separate himself from all other kinds of Sith and all others that we've seen before. And honestly, he is a much different kind of villain that we are used to in Star Wars. Deep down, he is a kind-hearted person who genuinely wants to see the galaxy at its best. Like Anakin though, whose intentions were pure and just wanting to save his wife, the dark side twisted and corrupted these noble causes and made the two Jedi servants of evil. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the complexity of Dooku. Dooku's personality is that of being a noble stoic. Unlike most Jedi, Dooku cared about his appearance and made an effort to look his best, indicative of his noble heritage. This outwardly represented how he wanted the Jedi to present themselves: cunning, professional, and intelligent. Despite his straight and level-headed nature, however, Dooku was just as much of a maverick as Qui-Gon Jinn was, doing each act as a Jedi as he saw fit for any situation, not as the code dictated he should handle himself. We get to see this quite a bit in all of the Dooku shorts, especially on Raxus when he defies the council orders in order to solve the issue with the immediate and course that he decided to take, taking matters into his own hands when defending the farmers against the senator. Dooku even went as far as using the Force on his own Padawan to ensure that he didn't get in his way. However, Dooku may seem sharp and cold on the outside, although he does genuinely care for Qui-Gon Jinn and all of his friends. In the canon novel Master and Apprentice, both Qui-Gon Jinn and Rey Averroes frequently talk and think about their apprenticeships under Dooku. In their memories, Dooku was a strict, stern man who was emotionally distant and quite reserved with any sort of praise. There were many small gestures that Dooku did for Qui-Gon as a boy that showed his appreciation for him. And of course, in the episode Justice, Dooku praises Qui-Gon for acting as a Jedi should and saving many lives, even outwardly calling Qui-Gon much wiser than he, which for Dooku is no idle statement. This Jedi Master was one who didn't acknowledge work unless it was good work. However, in both this series and in Attack of the Clones, we can tell how much Dooku can't help but show his appreciation and respect for Qui-Gon Jinn, to the point where he trusted Qui-Gon's judgment and would have tried to turn him to the dark side. In Attack of the Clones, when Dooku is talking with Obi-Wan, he mentions how much he misses Qui-Gon. Furthermore, Dooku talks about how he really could just use his wisdom and needed Qui-Gon in this moment. Just from this, we know that Dooku was bursting with pride over his apprentice and considered him far more wise than any member on the council. It seems to me that Dooku may even hold Qui-Gon's wisdom in higher value than that of Yoda's. Concerning Yoda, Dooku seems to actually have a rather low opinion of his own master, and the two do not seem to agree in the slightest. In fact, it seems that Dooku understands how powerful Yoda is, and because of that, he resents him. Here is a quote by Dooku: "The Order's problem is Yoda. No being can wield that kind of power for centuries without being complacent at best, or corrupt at worst. He has no idea what has overtaken him. He no longer sees all the cumulative evils that the Republic tolerates and fosters, from slavery to endless wars. He never asks himself, why are we not acting to stop this? Live alongside corruption too long, and you no longer notice the stench. The Jedi cannot help the slaves of Tatooine, but they can help the slave masters." This was said by Dooku to Sidious as one of their many conversations. I think this quote exemplifies everything that he truly feels about Yoda and the Jedi Council as a whole. Dooku hated corruption ever since he was a Padawan. In fact, as a Padawan learner, he nearly killed 2 Jedi Knights because he had been led to the assumption that they were traitors. He was so adept at lightsaber combat that he beat them both and had to be stopped by other Jedi Masters. This brings us to our next point that both this quote and the meaning between Dooku and Sidious in the final episode tells us, which is that Dooku is a real hero, just a very brash one. The screaming similarities between Dooku and Anakin are very clear, and it is quite unfortunate that the two never really had an extended conversation, and a conversation where they weren't at each other's throats. Both of them are heroes at heart, and they both want to do the best thing for the galaxy. And yet, this justice and heroism leads them down a very dark path. Dooku shows us here that he is really actually a very kind-hearted person, at least at first, and his frustrations come about in a storm of righteous fury when he sees those less fortunate than him in pain. In the case of the farmers, he became enraged and force-choked the senator and was fully prepared to actually murder him for his corruption. While not the Jedi way in any stretch, we can see that he only got this way after seeing the villagers in pain and hearing the senator's villainous speech about turning them into examples. Up until then, Dooku was calm and collected, remaining professional throughout all the negotiations, and even despite being fired upon by the senator's security detail, he remains calm. However, the moment he lost his reason is when the senator venomously declared that he would destroy the people that he had already let suffer long enough. It was multiple of these occurrences, compounded by the fact that they were coming straight from the Senate that the Jedi Order was taking commands from, that changed Dooku's heart permanently. In the episode entitled Choices, we watch as Dooku investigates the first of many Jedi murders to come into the service of politics. This was one of the main reasons that Dooku considered leaving the Order in the first place. He was absolutely infuriated by the way that the Jedi were laying down their lives for political reasons, and getting caught up in business that they had no reason being in. The final straw was of course Qui-Gon Jinn, his own apprentice, and his death. Despite all of Mace Windu's warnings, Dooku simply couldn't accept that the Jedi Master's death was just circumstance, and he desired to know more about what was really going on. This, of course, ties into what we already know about Dooku, which is that he genuinely cares about all Jedi, a sentiment that persists even after he becomes a Sith Lord. We know for a fact that Dooku actively avoids direct conflict with Jedi, as he abstains from killing them himself. Now obviously, his record isn't squeaky clean, as his indirect Jedi kills are in the hundreds just due to his work with Jango Fett and the engineering of the Clone Wars as a whole. With that said though, he will do everything he can to stop from killing Jedi. By his own hand, he has killed 5 Jedi that we know of, that being Lom Pike, Cav Bayons, Master Teepli, Master Sifo Dyas, and now recently, Master Yaddle. In many of these cases, he was either acting out of self-defense or to keep one of the Jedi from releasing vital information. The point being that it is never out of malicious intent that Dooku raises his blade against a Jedi. In fact, I don't really think that Dooku ever liked killing out of malicious intent whatsoever, which sets him apart from many other Sith Lords such as Sidious, Vader, and Maul. It could be said that out of all of them, he may even have the best heart. While the dark side does corrupt all intentions, no matter how pure, we can tell that Dooku at least makes an attempt to keep his goals in front of him at all times. In the beginning, Dooku allies with the Sith because his ideologies with the Jedi have been polarized, and he wants to simply rid the galaxy of corruption. However, he still feels guilty for betraying all that he knows, even though he is convinced that this path is the right one. In Attack of the Clones, Dooku seems more like a political idealist with a set of morals that follows him through his endeavors. He tries at every turn to gain allies, even going as far to reveal information that the Sith had infiltrated the Senate to Obi-Wan, essentially his grandson. During the Clone Wars, we watch as Dooku progressively slides deeper into the pit of the dark side, and all these morals previously mentioned begin to be melted away one by one. War crimes are abound, and while he doesn't delight in the suffering of others, we can tell it slowly stops bothering him, and he gets to the point where he will decisively murder anyone who crosses him. For a while, it didn't seem as though Dooku really cared much about the Sith, and he seemed to withhold a certain part of himself from the dark side. I say this because it is very rare that we see Dooku actually have the yellow Sith eyes so indicative of the dark side. While this feature can be suppressed, it takes a very long time, and it is very deep in the Clone Wars before we see this feature in Dooku ever show itself. Even by Revenge of the Sith, Dooku seems to have mellowed out somewhat, and remains just being a collected and professional Jedi, or at least a former Jedi. Though we know at this point, he has gone so far down the dark path that he is performing Sith rituals alongside Sidious. But now, I would actually like to talk about this relationship with Sidious, which is a rather interesting one. At first, it seems like Dooku and Sidious are close confidants, conspiring with one another in the shadows of the Coruscant buildings, right under the nose of the Jedi Temple. However, once the Clone Wars begins, their relationship shifts to being one of control and obedience. Dooku genuflects before Sidious whenever they speak, and Sidious, now with Dooku fully within his grasp, seems to have no reservations about abusing him, which we see several times during the Clone Wars. Sidious keeps Dooku basically isolated, pretending to be his friend, and then swiftly punishing him for even small failures. Does this sound familiar? Of course, this was the exact technique that Sidious used to manipulate Vader, and the cycle continued, first being one of friendship, and later abuse. Count Dooku was fiercely intelligent, and even though he was outplayed by Sidious in the end, he did have a plan. You see, it is my belief that Dooku was faking out Sidious this whole time, with his apprentice being Ventress. She was incredibly powerful and was growing in power every single day and extremely rapidly. Dooku knew how much Sidious hated Talzin, so he kept Talzin close, and perhaps took on Ventress as an apprentice to purposefully misdirect Sidious's attention. Meanwhile, he was actually setting his sights on raising another powerful apprentice to help him overthrow Sidious. At first, his plan was for Obi-Wan, going back to the events of Attack of the Clones, as Dooku was trying almost desperately to get the apprentice of his apprentice on his side, going as far as betraying Sidious to confide in Obi-Wan to tell him that the Sith had control of the Senate. Unfortunately for him, Kenobi, like his master, remained staunchly within the light. With this failure, Dooku tried to perhaps use Savage Opress, openly telling Savage that it was his plan to betray Sidious with his help. That, of course, though, turned up as another failure, as it was just a ploy by Ventress to get to Dooku. In the novel Dark Disciple, Dooku takes on Quinlan Vos as his apprentice, and perhaps was going to use him as well, but never got the chance to, as Vos was turned back to the light side in the end. Dooku ran out of options, and frankly, ran out of time. He desired to kill Sidious, and had decided to wait until the Empire was on the rise before doing so. His fatal mistake. He bided his time, and made the intention to kill Sidious sometime either during or after Order 66. Unfortunately, Sidious knew this, and got the jump on him, and Dooku learned the hard way that one can't truly outplay a Sith Master. Count Dooku's story is one of tragedy, but yet is extremely compelling, and I'm glad we got this much of Dooku's real personality in these Tales of the Jedi shorts, where we got to see him as he truly was as a Jedi, not just a villain. But my friends, what are your thoughts on the complexity of Darth Tyrannus, Dooku? Did you enjoy his episodes in Tale of the Jedi? And do you like when we do these deep, in-depth character breakdowns? Let us know in the comments down below, and as always my friends, may the Force be with you, and have a great day. Why was it a controversial decision, and almost a bad decision outright, that Yoda, the Grand Master at the time, trained a young Dooku? And what were the lasting consequences of this master and apprentice relationship? Greetings, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome to the Archives. The Jedi Master turned Sith Lord Dooku has one of the most interesting pasts of almost any character in all of the lore, and especially within the Jedi. We get to see a great deal of his past in many works, such as the novel Dooku Jedi Lost, as well as the Tales of the Jedi miniseries. In it, we discover that Dooku is a largely misunderstood Jedi that ended up falling to the dark side after getting repeatedly shortchanged by the Jedi. He is quite similar to Anakin Skywalker in that way, in the way that he became disillusioned with the Jedi. But of all of the Jedi, the one that caught the greater fury of his ire would be his own master in Yoda. The relationship between Yoda and Dooku was always a strained one, even before Dooku's eventual fall. The Grand Master of the Order had chosen his apprentice in the young Dooku, and when this happened, it was the talk of the Jedi Temple. In fact, the largest reason many talked about this in the first place was because of how controversial of a decision it was, and for the Grand Master to actually take on an apprentice, and especially a young Jedi like Dooku. So, come along with us today, my friends and acolytes, as we open up yet another holocron, and discover why Dooku's apprenticeship under Yoda was met with such controversy by the Jedi. To understand this, we'll first need to turn the clock back to Dooku's youngling days. As a toddler, Dooku's manifested Force sensitivity frightened his father, Count Gora of Sereno. Dooku's father highly disliked the Jedi, did not want his son being like them, and so he decided to abandon the young child and leave him to die in the cold. Jedi Seekers happened to find him, and brought the infant into the Jedi Temple to be trained as one of them. Thrown out and betrayed by his father and family, Dooku was now on the path of a Jedi. Dooku would grow up in the temple having extremely vague memories of his homeworld, but amazingly still remembered the aristocratic nature of his upbringing, as he carried himself in a very refined manner. His striving for success also put him far beyond the other younglings of his time, as he dedicated himself to the study of the Force, and more importantly, of the blade, in a way that no other student committed themselves to. Because of this, he mostly isolated himself, but still had a friend in the Jedi Sifo-Dyas. Dooku's nature and excellence stoked the jealousy of a few of the other Padawans who took to harassing Dooku, but Dooku always refrained from lashing out at them because he simply knew that he was better, and that this would only belittle himself. One day, the youngling pack would all be taking a field trip to the world of Sereno, Dooku's home planet, where they were given a demonstration on behalf of the Jedi Order. The field trip was headed by Grandmaster Yoda and the Jedi Terra Sanube. During this trip, Dooku would get into trouble as he would actually once again meet his actual family, including his father Gora. However, the Count scorned the boy, and then Dooku would be abducted, though he was managed to rescue by none other than himself and the help of a few of his friends, doing so by dipping slightly into the dark side against his captors, touching the dark side for the very first time in Dooku's life. Following this, the young boy was distraught, and Dooku eventually approached Grandmaster Yoda about the truth of his upbringing as a Jedi, and the Grand Master divulged the whole story about how his father gave him up, and attempted to even kill him as an infant. Later on, upon returning to the Jedi Temple, Sifo-Dyas and Dooku would let their curiosity get the better of them, when the two young Padawans snuck into the forbidden section of the Jedi archives, where all of the darkside artifacts, holocrons, and texts were stored. This would be Dooku's second run-in with the dark side, as he ended up coming into contact with one of the artifacts that accosted him with visions that frightened and shocked him to his core. Visions of what he believed could be the future. Dooku lashed out with the Force and ended up injuring Sifo-Dyas and alerting the Jedi librarian to their mischief. After being given a lecture by Yoda as well as the librarian, the two younglings were given discipline, and that is when Dooku would meet a Jedi Master by the name of Lene Kostana. Initially, the young Dooku was wary and very mistrustful of the Jedi Master after she would refer to Yoda as a little goblin, which actually offended Dooku. After which, she had slipped Sifo-Dyas a book that was written by a Sith Lord by the name of Darth Kaldroth. This alarmed the young Dooku even further, who began to suspect that Kostana was secretly a Sith Lord, and Dooku tried to convince his friends to tell someone about it. However, Sifo-Dyas refused. Taking matters into his own hands, Dooku confronted the Jedi Master on a balcony of the Jedi Temple, interrogating her to figure out why she gave his friend a Sith manuscript. She said to the young Dooku that this had all been a test, though Dooku sensed a great deal of frustration and anger in her, which he believed legitimized his theory. The two engaged in a short duel, during which Master Kostana played an act of goading Dooku, using the tale of an ancient Sith Lord named Darth Sakaya as a lesson by comparing Dooku's curved hilt lightsaber to the Sith's own weapon, saying that they were mirrors of one another. The Jedi Master, though, quickly lost control of the situation as Dooku attacked her with a savage fury, beating away her defenses and nearly killing her. Keep in mind, Dooku is barely a Padawan yet, and he has just defeated a Jedi Master in single combat. Luckily, Yoda intervened and stopped the young Dooku before he slew Kostana, after which Yoda revealed that Kostana was in fact not a Sith, but a Jedi Master, a Jedi who specialized in the study of the Sith Lords. Master Kostana had a penchant for testing young Jedi to see if they would fall to the dark side with bait, which was a practice that Yoda heavily disapproved of. Funnily enough, after this moment, Dooku and Kostana would become very good friends, and Dooku would look up to her as a mentor figure, as well as an avenue to learn of the Sith, as he was fascinated by the Sith studies in his own right, and he wanted to become her apprentice, the darkness beginning to peer out of Dooku. Eventually, the day came for the younglings to pass their initiate trials and be selected by their masters to become Padawans. Dooku was first in his class, passing the initiate trials with flying colors, going so far as to defeat Sifo-Dyas in a sparring match, while blindfolded and having one arm tied behind his back, literally. Despite this, Sifo-Dyas was chosen by Kostana first as her apprentice. This act greatly confused and angered the young Dooku, because of the reputation that Dooku had already gotten for himself. A young boy with a great deal of anger and promise, but still, this was highly intimidating, and none of the Jedi Masters present wanted Dooku as an apprentice, seeing him as something of a liability and too much of a risk. This is all starting to sound very familiar, by the way. Finally though, the Order was shocked when Grandmaster Yoda stepped forward and claimed Dooku as his new apprentice. This was practically unheard of, as hardly any Grandmaster ever took apprentices, and especially someone as high risk and highly skilled as Dooku, a youngling who had already shown quite an aptitude for the darkness. However, Yoda saw it something as a challenge, and he believed that he was the best person for the job of training the young Dooku, and honing him into becoming a great Jedi despite everything else. Yoda knows Dooku's connection to the dark side was very strong, and more than this, Yoda knew that Dooku knew a lot about his family, which gave him emotional baggage. With that said though, the Grandmaster was confident that the young boy would make an exceptional Jedi if given the proper training and given the chance. The young boy was powerful, far more powerful than he probably even knew at that point in time, so there was no doubt that only Yoda could train him. And honestly, we believe Yoda was correct. Dooku grew up to be an outstanding Jedi, making it to mastership and even having prospects of being on the Jedi Council. Dooku's fall to the dark side had relatively nothing to do with his upbringing or his time as a youngling. What I mean is, for the most part, it wasn't Dooku's own lusts of failings that brought him to the dark side. The blame for his fall rests squarely on the shoulders of the Jedi Council, who failed him and the Republic time and time again. Now, obviously everyone is responsible for their own deeds and own choices, but Dooku was brought to a dark place because of his circumstances, rather than the strength of his character. And that is a lot more than we can say for many Dark Jedi and Sith. The reason many in the Order found Dooku's apprenticeship under Yoda controversial was not only Yoda breaking a several thousand-year tradition, but also exactly who he was breaking it for. This was a youngling that was known by now as the one who attacked a Jedi Master, and we all know how rumors spread. Important details get left out, so no one really knew that it was Kostana who had goaded Dooku into doing so. Nevertheless, this was the reputation that the boy now had. But anyway, Acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. The great Count Dooku is known as one of the finest duelists of an entire generation. If not for the existence of Yoda or Darth Sidious, Dooku was considered the prime lightsaber duelist of the Clone Wars era, with many believing that Dooku actually outclassed Sidious and Yoda. Surprisingly though, Dooku's skill with the blade wasn't very well respected in the Jedi Order, especially when he first decided that it would be his path to study the way of Jedi combat. Grandmaster Yoda in particular was dubious about his apprentice's dedication to Form 2 Makashi, beyond Dooku's chosen form. Yoda was also quite disapproving of the way that Dooku constructed his lightsaber. All of this would eventually lead to Yoda and Dooku getting in a heated argument about the practicality of specializing in saber-to-saber combat, especially considering the era of peace that both Jedi were experiencing. In today's Holocron, we are going to highlight exactly why Dooku made these choices with his lightsaber, and discuss why Yoda was actually wrong to say that Dooku's decisions were impractical. But right before we cut our way into this topic, we want to invite you to join us if you haven't already. Our library is updating every day with Holocrons just like this one, so be sure to slash that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what topics you want to hear about and explored further. So now my friends, let us begin. The young Dooku was always a contrarian when growing up in the temple. From his approach to his studies to the way he carried himself, he was set apart from the rest of the younglings. He was always more inclined towards battle, and although he had a curiosity towards the dark side, Dooku staunchly believed in the Jedi values of protecting innocence. It was this staunch belief that would eventually lead him to becoming disillusioned with the Jedi, since they were only protecting planets that were a part of the Republic. But anyway, Dooku's studies into the Sith led him to a truth that no other Jedi was able to accept. Dooku believed that the Sith were not gone. Dooku was one of the only ones who picked up on the historical inconsistencies about the ending of the Sith Order. Not only was he skilled, but he was a brilliant mind, and because of this, Dooku decided that he would prepare in case the Jedi should ever encounter the Dark Acolytes in the future. A certain Jedi Master would pretend to be a Sith Lord in order to test him. Dooku confronted this Jedi and dueled her one-on-one in one of the Jedi Temple's balconies. He would even get very close to defeating her before he was stopped by Yoda. It was from that point on that Yoda had his eyes on Dooku, and would eventually take the boy as his own personal apprentice, something that was largely unheard of for a Jedi Grand Master. Sometime later, Dooku chose to specialize in Makashi, and dedicated most of his time to learning the ins and outs of lightsaber combat. This was largely concerning for Yoda, who believed that Dooku may be falling away from the Jedi path. Once Dooku built his lightsaber with a curved hilt, discarding the original, that's when Dooku and Yoda would get into a heated argument about his choices. Yoda did not believe that the Sith could be out there, and was totally denying that it was even a possibility. The Jedi Council and the vast majority of Jedi at the time refused to believe that the Sith existed. The implications of such an idea were not one that they were willing to even consider. As a result, anytime a Jedi seemed to be more saber combat focused, it raised many questions. At the time, there were no saber-wielding opponents to encounter on the regular in the galaxy, and as such, most Jedi specialized in other forms, with the dueling forms becoming more and more rare. This was especially concerning because Makashi focuses one true purpose, while many of the other forms had various functions. Makashi, though, had one: to defeat a lightsaber wielder. Other forms like Sarisu, Naiman, and Ataru are fit to be used in a wide variety of scenarios. However, Makashi was specifically meant for saber-on-saber combat with a single opponent. It wasn't fantastic at blast deflection, and was certainly poor when facing multiple enemies. However, the effectiveness of Form 2 in single combat was unmatched. When the situation does arise for a Makashi user to show their talent, the battle automatically begins in their favor. With measured footwork, surgically precise strikes, and a big focus on disarmament, Form 2 is the undisputed champion of single saber combat. This meant that should a Makashi master decide to issue a formal challenge to another wielder of the Force, the scales are tipped in their favor unless the opponent excels in single combat, which many Jedi at the time did not. This is what made Dooku such a deadly force, as he didn't just study Makashi, he was obsessed with it. He would drill countless hours in the training hall, not accepting anything less of himself than complete and utter perfection. The result was nothing short of mastery. He was described as a fencer, one who moved so gracefully with the blade that it was as if he was dancing. Movement, positioning, leverage. To Dooku, these were as natural to him as breathing. Dooku, though, wasn't satisfied with just specializing in the best combat form. He needed to maximize his effectiveness in a duel, and with that in mind, he styled his lightsaber to have an elbow bend in the hilt, giving it its famous curved design. The curved hilt of the lightsaber is one that is specifically important because it was a design choice that was solely meant for dueling. This is what made Yoda confront Dooku. This final design change, as a curved hilt, was a declaration that his lightsaber was a weapon meant to kill. When one puts a curve in their lightsaber hilt, it creates a unique function that allows the saber to be far more unpredictable and surgically precise. It was more ergonomic, which allowed for it to rest comfortably in the palm of the hand. This allowed for the practitioner to make their strikes more accurate and even faster. Thrusts became quick jabs, and entire slashes only required the duelist to flick their wrist. Many of the fencers in our own world, which are Olympic fencers, prefer the curved hilted design, with Sir Christopher Lee, a famous fencer himself, also preferring the design. But for wielders of the Force, the curved hilt held a secret function. Lightsaber duelists drill for endless hours to combine their Force intuition with their blade, and most of the time, they are perfectly precise, able to predict where their opponent's weapon is at all times. But with this curved hilt, it causes the blade strikes to be angled just a few centimeters off of where a standard lightsaber would be, just enough to where the blade will be more likely to slip past, whereas the opponent believes that it will actually land. For Force sensitives that all rely on this precision, just a few centimeters is life and death, and Dooku knew this. It was for his lightsaber, and Dooku's unshakable belief that the Sith were not gone, that caused a massive conflict between himself and Grandmaster Yoda. What's shocking, though, is Yoda was actually wrong at the time. Not only were the Sith alive, but Yoda was denying the fact that the Dark Acolytes still existed, even believing that the Sith did not know how to construct lightsabers of their own if they were around at all. Yoda believed that the Sith, if they even existed anymore, were exceptionally weak and far beyond the skills of even a common Jedi. Dark Jedi were still a rarity, but they existed, not to mention that Jedi did fall to the dark side every now and then. Although it would be a long time before Dooku actually fought other saber wielders, his skill with the lightsaber made him completely unstoppable to any being in the galaxy, blaster wielder or not. There were still many beings who used vibro weapons, electrostaffs, and other melee options on the battlefield. These things were not yet obsolete, and many pirates, raiders, and even government bodyguards carried them along with blasters. DOOKU proved several times to be able to absolutely dismantle any being who came close to him. While saber-to-saber combat was a rarity, DOOKU's quick reflexes came as a result of his training in Form 2, making him indomitable. We see this in action in Tales of the Jedi. It didn't matter what sort of weapon his enemy used. DOOKU was unshakable. In fact, he got so good at Makashi that he made up for its weaknesses by sheer skill and grit alone. He was able to deflect blaster bolts just as good as a Surisu wielder, and multiple opponents were never a problem for the great DOOKU, who had learned to isolate individuals and pick them apart systematically. He could fend off Legends General Grievous with ease, and was able to literally stalemate Grandmaster Yoda on Geonosis, a feat unheard of. DOOKU definitively won the argument when he himself turned to the dark side. Makashi was more important than ever. The galaxy needed it. And that's just the thing. It doesn't matter what era the Jedi Order find themselves in. It is always practical to have a strong foundation on one's dueling skills. Something that Yoda's Jedi had forgot. DOOKU proved its practicality, the practicality of the curve-tilted lightsaber, and one's skill in combat is only ever measured by the dedication of the individual. But anyway, my friend.
Famously known as one of the most skilled lightsaber duelists and Sith Lords we have ever seen in Star Wars history. He's perhaps even more famous for his past. His past is one of the most powerful and noted Jedi Masters of his era. A Jedi Master even held above the standards of Mace Windu, and according to some, the equal of Grandmaster Yoda. But as we would come to learn following Dooku's turn to the dark side of the Force, he was always, secretly so, fascinated with the dark side. In today's video, we will discuss Count Dooku's, or at the time, Padawan Dooku's first encounter with the dark side of the Force, and how it would ultimately shape him into one of the most skilled Jedi killers and Jedi betrayers of all time. As is common with most Jedi turned Sith Lords, Dooku was extremely exceptional and powerful, even as a Jedi Padawan. As a Jedi youngling, he was among the first of his class to be selected by a Jedi Master for training. Even again as a youngling, it was a shoo-in that one day Dooku would become a noted and powerful Jedi Master. His skills with the lightsaber as well as the Force were simply on another level than his peers, and with this, just as it later would the Padawan Anakin Skywalker, would breed great jealousy. Jealousy by the other Jedi Padawans that Dooku trained with. One of Dooku's closest friends as a Jedi Padawan was named Lorian Nad, who was also a skilled Padawan in his own right. The two of them were the top of their class. However, much to Nad's disappointment and anger, Dooku was selected first to be trained by a Jedi Master. And even more crushing to Nad than this, Dooku was selected by a Jedi that currently sat upon the Jedi Council. It was this single act of his friend being chosen before him that led Nad to question his existence as a Jedi. Nad knew that he wanted power, but he was unsure if the Jedi path was the best way to attain this power. Because of this, Nad devised a plan to break into the Jedi archives and steal power for himself. He did not want to leave the Jedi Order yet though. First, he needed to prove his superiority over his friend Dooku, and prove to the Jedi Master that had not selected him that he was the superior prodigy. Once breaking into the Jedi archives, Nad would make the biggest mistake of his life. Not only selecting a Sith holocron, but the most dangerous Sith holocron in the temple. One of the most ancient and dark side oriented artifacts that the Jedi Order had ever been able to obtain. A holocron so dangerous that even the Jedi Council members refused to look upon it. We will discuss more about this ancient holocron in a future video. All you need to know though is that it was extremely old and extremely dangerous. Wanting to reconcile with his friend, Dooku ventured to Nad's room, where upon entering the room, he witnessed the young Jedi Padawan looking intensely into the Sith holocron. For a moment, Dooku paused, as he felt something he had never had through the Force. It was here for the first time that he experienced the true state of the dark side, but it wasn't quite as awful as his masters had described. There was something about it that seemed to call to the young Dooku. Something warm, something welcoming. Just then though, the Jedi Master Oppo Rancisis entered the room, utterly shocked that the lost holocron was stolen by the seemingly seemingly two innocent Jedi Padawans, Oppo took the holocron for himself, again hiding it deep within the Jedi archive, somewhere no Padawan or even Knight should ever venture. It was here that Nad implicated Dooku in stealing the holocron, although this was completely untrue. Nad explained that together the two Jedi Padawans had broken into the archives in hope of furthering their power and prospects as knights. In this moment, Dooku was too shocked to contradict him, still too overwhelmed by this feeling of warmth that the dark side had granted him. When finally brought before the Jedi Council separately though, Dooku revealed the truth. He revealed that it was Nad and Nad alone that had stolen the Dark Holocron from the archive, and that he had done no such thing, that he was simply worried for his friend, thus why he entered the room. A true statement. Following this, Dooku was allowed to remain a Jedi Padawan, although some of his mentors would look at him more closely for a time. Nad, though, was cast from the Jedi Order, a disgrace and a failure. For decades, though, something remained within Dooku's mind. Maybe less than a thought and more of a feeling. That feeling that he had when he entered Nad's room. A feeling that that holocron had granted him. Something that would grow into a dangerous and deep obsession. But that is how a Jedi...
Many force abilities that are utilized by both the power of the light as well as the dark, and unfortunately sometimes students of the light are taught abilities that they later utilize for the dark side of the force. In this example, we will explore a force power that Yoda taught who he called at the time the greatest Jedi learner of the Jedi Order, and unfortunately an ability that would later be turned on Yoda's students. Today we break down the force ability that Yoda taught Dooku that he would later twist and use for the purpose of the Sith on Obi-Wan Kenobi as well as Anakin Skywalker. There is a difficult force ability called mind penetration that was often used by Master Yoda to sense the underlying distresses of his Jedi students. Yoda would often use the power to peer within the minds of Jedi in an effort to teach and aid them, as sometimes he could use the Force to help them unlock hidden power and knowledge within themselves. Yoda used the power as a sort of way to break down mental barriers within his students. Although dangerous in the wrong hands, Yoda used the power as a method to teach, as he only desired to show his students how to use the power without ill intent, and for the purpose of comfort, never for pain. Of course, as his Jedi Master, Yoda taught the ability to a young Dooku, who in return taught his own apprentice in Qui-Gon Jinn. However, as Dooku faced the Jedi Knight Obi-Wan Kenobi on Geonosis, he used an altered aggressive form of the power and an ability he now used for the dark side of the Force. Unfortunately, the same ability that was taught to him by Yoda himself. This comes from the novelization for Attack of the Clones when Dooku faces off against Obi-Wan. Dooku's slow pace spoke of an underlying arrogance, and was in sharp contrast to the briskness of his invasion into Obi-Wan's mind. Obi-Wan bit back a gasp and fled, trying to set new mental barriers in his wake. He'd had other Force users in his mind before, Qui-Gon, Anakin, even Master Yoda, but where their touches had been gentle, almost a caress, Dooku's was painful and humiliating. As Dooku penetrated the mind of Obi-Wan, he used the more advanced version known as DOOKU, which was meant to disrupt someone's connection to the Force, make him doubt himself, his beliefs, or his intentions. Such things disrupt connections to the Force, and death soon follows. This ability would later become a favorite of Darth Vader, as he too would penetrate the minds of Jedi in order to terrify and intimidate. Vader himself first experienced the power at the hands of Dooku when he was then called Anakin Skywalker, as Dooku penetrated Anakin's mind as well on several occasions. In truth though, the Force ability contributed to the death of Dooku, as it backfired against him and pulled Anakin into a rage that ended with Dooku's severed head at Anakin's feet. This is what Darth Sidious would later tell Darth Vader, or rather warn Darth Vader about DOOKU. DOOKU may backfire if it provokes an enemy into a mindless anger, but rage opens your enemy to the dark side, which can be exploited in its own way. But that was the forbidden Force. In many ways, the perfect pick for Palpatine to replace Maul as his Sith apprentice, as Dooku had once been a Jedi Master himself. Because of this, Dooku knew the ins and outs of the Jedi Order, but even more significant than this, he was one of the best and premier Jedi Masters in all of the Order. This made Dooku privy to secrets and knowledge other Jedi were totally unaware of. Dooku had the trust and experience that came with being a Jedi Master, and most significant of all, Dooku was known throughout the galaxy as one of the most famous Jedi to have ever lived.
His escapades and adventures were legend both within and outside of the Jedi Order. But it was for none of these reasons why Sidious truly selected Dooku, as although he loved the idea of corrupting a Jedi once as loyal and faithful as Dooku, Sidious made the final decision to recruit Dooku as his new apprentice for his experience in a single field. Sidious selected Dooku because for his entire life, whether he would admit it or not, the Force had trained and molded him to specifically kill Jedi. This is what Darth Sidious said concerning Dooku and his use of Form 2 lightsaber combat known as Makashi, the lightsaber form that allowed Dooku to kill dozens of Jedi upon his blade. It was Dooku's experience with the Form 2 fighting style that was a major consideration for Sidious when selecting the former Jedi to be his next student. He was fully aware that his apprentice would eventually engage in duels against other Jedi. Sidious believed Dooku's emphasis on pure lightsaber combat to be a tremendous advantage for the Sith Lord. Once Dooku left the Jedi Order to become an apprentice to the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, his skills became even more formidable. The Count's blade was quick as a viper striking. Among the other Jedi, perhaps only Mace Windu would have been his equal on neutral ground. But here on Vajun, steeped in the dark side, his blade work was malice made visible. Wickedness cut in red light. Here we learned that Dooku was selected in major part because of his skill in blade-to-blade combat and his ability to absolutely dismantle any Jedi that came against him in a lightsaber duel. Sidious selected Dooku to stand as a symbol of the superiority of the Sith over the Jedi, and therefore trained Dooku even further in his skills in lightsaber combat after his fall to the dark side of the Force. This made Dooku's already immaculate style of combat far more fierce and aggressive in nature. Although Sidious would not call Dooku the overall perfect apprentice, he would consider him the perfect pupil for the time being, as he was far more experienced and had far more pull than the desired apprentice in Anakin Skywalker, at least at that point in time. But that was the real reason as to why Darth Sidious selected Count Dooku to be his apprentice following the death, or supposed death, of Darth Maul. But leave your thoughts on this in the comments.
Dooku is a highly complex Star Wars character, one of the most complex in the entire series. As a gifted Jedi Master, he grew to see the corruption within the Republic as well as the wider Jedi itself, with them refusing to go on several missions for political means that Dooku believed that they should have gone on immediately, a sentiment that he would pass on to his Padawan in Qui-Gon Jinn. Dooku ultimately resolved that it was the dark side of the Force that would grant him the powers that he needed to be a faithful leader of the galaxy, believing it to be his duty in a sense to liberate the Jedi from the corrupt Republic, Senate, and even the Jedi, believing that he could construct it in a brand new, better way, even if that meant embracing the dark side of the Force. Dooku stayed with the Jedi Order for nearly his entire life. However, there was a singular event that caused him to leave the Jedi, ultimately embracing the path of the dark side. But first, Dooku required something that was not in the Jedi way, that being revenge. With it being Qui-Gon Jinn's death, that was the titular moment that would change Dooku, and as a result the galaxy forever, at the hands of Darth Maul. Qui-Gon Jinn's death devastated Dooku, so much so that he even resolved to leave the entirety of the Jedi Order. Despite Dooku and Qui-Gon not always agreeing philosophically about the Force and how the galaxy should be governed, Dooku had a burning respect and even a love for Qui-Gon Jinn. He was ultimately very proud of him, a sentiment that would follow even into Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is the exact reason why Dooku wanted to save Obi-Wan Kenobi from Order 66 and the Great Jedi Purge, with that love and respect of Qui-Gon carrying over to the young Kenobi. The question we will be posing today, though, does not occur when Dooku has embraced the path of the Sith, but rather, we will be exploring a story that takes place just after the events of the Phantom Menace, when Dooku, full of resolve, has decided to destroy the one Sith, with it being undeniable that Qui-Gon Jinn was killed by the newly returned Sith in Darth Maul. And today, we will be breaking down and uncovering the story of Dooku's revenge, and how this ultimately led him down the dark path. However, first his plan to destroy the Sith, and the individual behind Qui-Gon Jinn's death. So come with us today, students of the Force and acolytes of the galaxy, as we break down exactly Dooku's plan to destroy the Sith, and avenge his old Padawan and Qui-Gon Jinn. It was only a month following the death of Qui-Gon Jinn that Dooku had finally resolved to leave the Jedi Order indefinitely, with him deeming it his purpose to destroy the Sith. Before doing so, however, he met with the new Chancellor Palpatine. Similar to Anakin Skywalker after him, Dooku had actually formed a strong connection and relationship with Palpatine, who Dooku, a Jedi Master at the time, believed was a non-political leader that could lead the Senate into brighter days, which is why even before the young Skywalker, Dooku actually confided in Palpatine. Dooku revealed to Palpatine that the Jedi High Council had resolved to not look for the Sith, believing potentially that Obi-Wan Kenobi had defeated the Master of the Sith on Naboo. However, within every fiber of Dooku's being, he knew that Darth Maul was not the Master, but was simply the apprentice, and resolved to hunt down the Sith Master in the shadows and destroy the Sith utterly and completely, not out of righteousness for the light side and the Jedi, but out of pure revenge for his lost Padawan. Dooku believed that he could delve into the underworld of the galaxy and discover exactly who this hidden Sith Master was, as Dooku had grown to believe that the Sith had become far more political and far more connected than the days of the ancient Sith Empire, when they were purely bred warriors, which is exactly why Dooku speculated that they had been gone for so long, with Dooku being so ahead of his time that he correctly surmised that the Sith had in fact evolved and changed, and were now potentially far more dangerous than ever before. But Dooku believed that the Sith Lord had left a trail which he could follow. However, following this, something strange occurred in the conversation between Palpatine and Dooku, as Dooku subtly revealed that not only did he intend to leave the Jedi Order, but also that he had been following the dark side texts, and had now potentially even turned to the dark side of the Force. This deeply intrigued Palpatine at the time. Palpatine, who knew that Darth Plagueis had noted that Dooku one day could make a fine Sith had he not been so aligned with the Jedi. Palpatine then prodded further, asking if Dooku was sure that he wanted to avenge Qui-Gon Jinn's death by killing the Sith, to which Dooku had an interesting answer. Dooku admitted to Palpatine that perhaps the Sith were right, and although treasonous, he revealed that perhaps the Republic needed to be destroyed and reworked in a finer image, to which he stated that this could potentially even be the grand plan of the Sith, and that if the ideology of the Sith ultimately aligned with his own, he would seek a council with this hidden Sith Master. Dooku admitted that as a Jedi, he had huge political pull as well as pull within the Order, but not enough change to resolve a complete reboot of the galaxy and its governing system as a whole, something that he believed that the Sith might just possess. It was at this moment that Dooku knew that he had to fully turn to the dark side to achieve his goals. Dooku then revealed his hatred for the Jedi Council, as Dooku revealed that he had been heatedly debating with the Jedi Council about exploring the rift in the Force, a rift in the Force that he believed was created by the Sith nearly 50 years before the events of the Phantom Menace. Dooku explained that the Jedi simply wanted to contain the dark side, not destroy it. Upon thinking about the death of Qui-Gon Jinn and wanting to hunt down the Sith Master who was responsible for his death, and in essence, Dooku revealed that his goals aligned perfectly with that of the Sith, and that if he actually hunted down the Sith, perhaps the galaxy would be worse for it. Another Sith Lord would simply rise in his wake, as Dooku believed, as he believed that even if he destroyed the Sith Master, the dark side would still remain, and the Jedi would still be dogmatic and ultimately fools. Therefore, Dooku resolved to change his mind, rather than hunting down the Sith Master through the criminal underworld, believing that he could defeat him in single combat, an attempt to catch him off guard as a Jedi Master, disillusioned and ultimately leaving the Jedi Order. However, again, Dooku's goals and motives ultimately changed. It was this meeting with Palpatine, though, that ultimately sealed the fate of Jedi Master Dooku, as Dooku revealed that he could let go of the death of Qui-Gon Jinn if it meant the betterment of the history of the galaxy moving forward. And it was this final moment where Dooku agreed to completely let go of Qui-Gon Jinn and his memory and devote himself to a new path that allowed Darth Sidious to formally reach out to the fallen Jedi Master. Still though, this doesn't change Dooku's original plan, as the High Council sat back and sat idle. Dooku believed that the Sith had become well connected, and because of the fact that they were well connected, he believed that he could hunt them down, tracing his path all the way back to Tatooine in the first appearance of Darth Maul, meaning that if he sought Tatooine deep enough and sought the underworld of the Star Wars universe, he would sooner or later come against the Sith. especially if Dooku himself now moved in the shadows. Again though, this would never come to fruition, as Darth Sidious, Palpatine, would reveal himself to the Count. But anyway, the events of Attack of the Clones marks the very beginning of the Clone Wars, with the Battle of Geonosis kicking off the grueling 2-year galactic war that shaped the rest of the galaxy itself. However, the Battle of Geonosis set up far more than just a war, but also a very distinct rivalry between Anakin, Obi-Wan, and the new Sith Lord, Count Dooku. The Duel of Geonosis is one of the more iconic lightsaber duels in recent history, as it marks when the Jedi would officially declare war on the Sith once again, after hundreds of years of the Jedi believing the Sith had died. Count Dooku himself was once a Jedi, and would duel and defeat Obi-Wan and Anakin very quickly, despite both of them being considered talented knights. Obi-Wan, in fact, went down much faster than even his Padawan would, and following this duel, it would seem that almost every time Obi-Wan ever engaged Dooku, he would be put down extremely quickly. There has never been a moment that Obi-Wan has gotten to get a leg up on his master's master, a fact which would remain until the day that Dooku died. And it all started with that first failure on behalf of Obi-Wan on Geonosis. So what is it that made Obi-Wan so weak to Dooku on that day specifically? Why couldn't Obi-Wan last even half a minute against Darth Tyrannus? Well, today, my friends, we are going to open up yet another holocron and talk about why. But before we continue with the holocron, I'd like to introduce to you guys a brand new channel that I created about another one of my passions, that being the genre of horror. On the channel, we will be exploring various monsters, cryptids, and demons, as well as killers from some of the most famous films of all time. Right now on the channel, we've documented the history of the Exorcist demon Pazuzu, as well as the Death Angels from A Quiet Place, and most recently, we discussed the 7 stages of infection from the Last of Us universe. So if that's something that you're interested in, the horrendous wave will be linked down below. But now, let us begin. I think we can all go ahead and bypass the obvious statement that should be made. Count Dooku far outclasses Obi-Wan in blade skill during Geonosis. Dooku was considered by many, even Sidious, to be one of the greatest duelists of that era, with Sidious believing that the only rivals to Dooku in the blade were perhaps himself and the Grandmaster in Yoda, a hypothesis that would be proven, as Dooku was able to stalemate the great Grandmaster. A feat, need I remind you, that not even Sidious was capable of blade to blade. In Revenge of the Sith and their duel on Coruscant, Sidious in the novelization put away his lightsaber so that he could fall back on his force powers, of which he was the superior to Yoda, being overwhelmed by the blade skill of the Jedi Master of over 900 years. And yet, Dooku managed to match Yoda and only distract him for a moment so that he could get away before more Jedi arrived. The question of skill and experience is barely even a factor here. However, we didn't want to just leave it at that. We wanted to dive into the exact hows and why and whys on how Dooku was able to dismantle and frankly embarrass Obi-Wan Kenobi specifically. Why this is one of Obi-Wan's greatest defeats as one of the greatest swordsmen of all time. Dooku was ready and Dooku embarrassed him. But something important needs to be addressed. We can't simply discount the fact that this was the same Obi-Wan who, as a Padawan, kept up with and even defeated Darth Maul, an assassin trained by Sidious to kill Jedi. Unfortunately, Obi-Wan would find Dooku to be in a caliber all his own, mostly because unlike Maul, Dooku was entirely familiar with the Jedi way and method of fighting. It would be around this time that Obi-Wan had ceased training in the form that he used as a Padawan under Qui-Gon Jinn, Form 4 Ataru, and Kenobi began to practice the methods of Form 3, the all-defensive form Surisu. Not only was the defense far better for deflecting blaster fire, but he witnessed how Qui-Gon had gotten tired out in his older age against Maul, which resulted in his defeat. Because of this, Obi-Wan began to study the more energy-conservative Surisu so that he would be able to last much longer in drawn-out engagements. Obi-Wan knew that since the Sith had returned, he was going to need a form that would suit him against a stronger opponent, because Ataru had not only failed Qui-Gon, but himself as well. Obi-Wan's rage had unbalanced him, and his offensive sequences positioned him right in front of the reactor shaft that Maul was able to push him down. Ataru was simply not meant for Obi-Wan. However, Obi-Wan was not yet proficient in Form 3 lightsaber combat against Dooku either. Remember, this was only Attack of the Clones Obi-Wan. He was still a Jedi Knight and had much room to grow. Dooku noticed this when they began to fight. After a single burst of Force lightning, Dooku could tell from Obi-Wan's block that he was practicing Surisu. So the natural thing to do was for Dooku to bring Obi-Wan out of his defensive shell and force him to attack. You see, Surisu functions beautifully as a way to protect oneself against many opponents or one very aggressive enemy. The form was designed to try and draw out engagements as a way to create holes in your enemy's defense, and then take advantage of the given openings. This is why Obi-Wan was so perfect against General Grievous. He was able to deflect all of his attacks and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. Not striking with all of his force at once, but rather cutting around his opponent's defense. The key to Surisu. The weakness though with Surisu is that it has very few offensive options in its sequences. This lack of offense was what actually caused Surisu practitioners to create Form 5 lightsaber combat, the form that Anakin would later use. Clearly, this would be something that Dooku was quite well versed in, so by then fighting defensively, not attacking first, but letting Obi-Wan come to him, Dooku put himself at the advantage. Could he have fought Obi-Wan using Surisu and defeated him? Most likely, if he had chosen to go on the offensive. But on Geonosis, Dooku was trying to escape and prevent himself from being captured by the Jedi. Had Obi-Wan used Surisu, he could have stalled long enough for Yoda and the other clones to get there and arrest him. By staying on the defense though for the moment, Dooku forced Obi-Wan to rely on the only offensive knowledge that he had, that being Ataru. The fourth form of lightsaber combat was one that Dooku was extremely familiar with, a form he knew almost as well as Makashi, although he never implemented it. Not only was Form 4 the chosen style of Dooku's master Yoda, but also of his pupil in Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon's form was something Dooku could pick out like a second language. In this way, Obi-Wan's own knowledge of Ataru stood no chance, especially considering he was out of practice with it, and Dooku's form of Makashi famously counters Form 4. Essentially, Dooku forced Obi-Wan to pick the worst form imaginable against Dooku. The problem with Kenobi here is that his offense is weak and lacking, an issue that persisted even after Geonosis. During the Clone Wars, almost every time Obi-Wan goes on the offensive, he loses. A perfect example of this is his reunion with Maul during the Clone Wars. This is especially telling because Obi-Wan dueled a weaker Maul. Not only had he lost his lower legs, and his potential in the Force was essentially cut in half, but he was still recovering from his exile. This should have been an easy win for Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan as a Jedi Master should have easily taken him out. However, the death of Qui-Gon Jinn still laid heavy on Obi-Wan's mind, and his rage unbalanced him. Unlike Anakin, whose rage made him stronger, when Obi-Wan actively gives into anger, he drastically diminishes his strength. This is what Maul was relying on and preying on, and this is the lesson that Obi-Wan ultimately learned when he would best Maul for the final time on Tatooine many years later. But back to Dooku specifically, Obi-Wan again would never manage to defeat the Count. When it came to Geonosis, had Obi-Wan possessed the knowledge of Surisu that he did in Revenge of the Sith, then the outcome may have been much different. In Revenge of the Sith and the novelization, Obi-Wan's Surisu had become so good that it even shocked Dooku on the Invisible Hand. Dooku had just anticipated that he would be able to stomp him out just as he did on Geonosis. But in the novel, Dooku realizes the full potential of Kenobi's Form 3. The perfected form. Dooku describes Obi-Wan's lightsaber as being bewilderingly fast and complicated in its defensive sequences. And what truly terrified Dooku was how perfectly it paired with the likes of Anakin's Form 5 gem So. In Attack of the Clones though, Obi-Wan didn't possess the full knowledge of the third form, and wasn't yet the master of Surisu that he one day would be. It wasn't in his skill set yet to be patient and outlast Dooku. His eagerness to capture the Count and end the war before it began overshadowed the importance of what was happening. Of course, we can't entirely blame Obi-Wan though. During the ship ride to the duel with Dooku, Obi-Wan knew in his inner thoughts that it would take Anakin and himself alone that could only stand a chance against Dooku maybe. And when he engages him alone after Anakin attacks too abruptly, he knows that he's fighting a losing battle. Obi-Wan knew full well that he had no chance of defeating Dooku by himself. He even says as much during the gunship chase when Anakin wanted to go back for Padme. Obi-Wan says, "I can't take Dooku alone. I need you." Obi-Wan was confident in Anakin's strength enough to know that perhaps with their combined power, they could match, or maybe if they were lucky, defeat the Count. By now, he had seen what Anakin was capable of, and knew that even though his Padawan was inexperienced, he made up for it with raw power. Anakin's strength and talent would surely give them just the edge they needed to overcome Dooku, so much as they worked together. Whether this is true or not, we'll never know, as nothing went according to plan. When Obi-Wan was left all alone, it was here that after witnessing Dooku use the legendary dark side ability that he likely only heard of in stories in Dun Mak, penetrating his enemies' minds, insulting them, that Obi-Wan realized just how overwhelmed he truly was. He forced Obi-Wan on the offensive, where he was weak. Dooku adopted a near-perfect style of defensive Makashi, and when Obi-Wan desperately went on the offensive, Dooku was able to slip his guard and intentionally decides not to murder Obi-Wan, instead simply nicking his leg as a show of disappointment. Greetings, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. Of all the lightsaber forms that are regularly practiced, few have more interesting history than the second form of lightsaber combat, the lightsaber form known as Makashi. Form 2 has been in use since the very ancient days of the Jedi Order, having been invented during the Great Schism, the first Great Schism in fact, when the Jedi suddenly found themselves fighting against one another and saber-wielding foes such as themselves. Form 1 wasn't working, and the Dark Jedi would actually be the first ones to pioneer the duelist form before it went into regular use among the wider order. But things would change over centuries, and by the time of the Clone Wars, Form 2 is something of a relic of the old ways. It is hardly used by any Jedi in the Order, except of course by one Dooku. His study and mastery over the archaic lightsaber form gained him much notoriety in the Order. Dooku became such a prolific duelist that his departure from the Jedi was a major blow. After this, Dooku's power only grew to the point where he was almost completely undefeatable in single combat, with even Grandmaster Yoda having difficulty overcoming him or matching him. But the question we raise today is, why did Dooku choose Makashi out of all of the other forms? What drew him to this specific form to master? And furthermore, what was the original reason that Makashi even went out of practice among the Jedi? All this shall be answered in today's holocron, so bow to your opponent and ready your blade, because this holocron we are about to open. Why did Form 2 fade out of popularity among the Jedi? This one is a bit more straightforward, and has to do with the Ruusan reformation and the perceived extinction of the Sith Empire. Makashi at this time was still a prevalent form used by the Jedi up until a few years after 1000 BBY. Interestingly, we can actually trace a point in time prior that the form began to fade from widespread use. Unfortunately, it all had to do with the form's primary shortcomings, that being that it wasn't well suited for blast deflection and it was weak against multiple opponents. The start of the fall of Makashi would likely begin around the year 3681 BBY. Or the start of the Great Galactic War. During this war between the Republic and the new Sith Empire, most Jedi used forms that were suited for multiple combat scenarios. This specific war was like no other, as it wasn't just Jedi versus soldier, or even Jedi versus Sith. Battlefields were swarmed with a large mixture of enemies, since the Republic and the Sith Empire fought with foot soldiers right next to their Force wielders, making it a far different war. Jedi could be deflecting blaster fire one moment and then facing a Sith warrior the next, and because of this, a well-rounded combat style was absolutely necessary for survival. Furthermore, in these large-scale battlefield engagements, Force users were often surrounded by enemies, and were forced to switch between opponents with absolute flawless consistency, otherwise they would simply be cut down, either by the blade or by blaster fire. In the Galactic War, there was no margin for error when the battle began. It was because of this that very few Jedi chose to continue practicing the prevalent second form of lightsaber combat, the duelist-centric form. In the war, styles such as 3, 4, and 5 were the most popular, as they offered a lot more versatility on the battlefield. Many Jedi outright deemed Form 2 as a major weakness. Makashi suffered from the lack of flexibility. The thing about Form 2 is that it performs one function, and performs it perfectly. But in the end, it is only one. In single combat with another lightsaber wielder, which again did not happen very often during this war, there was no equal to Makashi's power. But that strength was a little too niche for a grand majority of Jedi during this conflict, and they needed forms that granted them more options in the dynamic situations that they found themselves in. But it should be noted that mostly during this time, it was the Sith that kept Form 2 alive during this engagement, feeling an obsession with besting Jedi at the blade, no matter how versatile the other forms may be. Sith assassins often found themselves in single combat scenarios, and so, although the usage of Form 2 was weakened, it was still kept alive by the Sith. Moving beyond this, many members of the Sith High Command also preferred Form 2 Makashi, as they would only engage opponents worthy to meet them at the blade. After this, Makashi would make a resurgence during a war known as the War of Light and Darkness, a war which ended in 1000 BBY, culminating in the Ruusan campaign. This would be when the Army of Light faced the Brotherhood of Darkness, and while there were ground troops using blasters, this war featured armies of saber wielders. When the war concluded, the Sith were thought to be all but destroyed, and the Jedi ushered in an era of peace by their Grand Master, Fei Coven, a Grand Master who feared that the Jedi had gone too far, and were not military soldiers, but should be keepers of peace. Again, the Jedi swung too far in their dogma, and because of this, not only avoided anything to do with the Sith, but actively shut down anyone who had rumors that the Sith may not truly have been killed that fateful day. The galaxy had been beaten down and was exhausted by war. The Senate then disbanded the Army of Light in an event known as the Ruusan Reformation, and the Jedi signed a decree that they would never organize their own formal military ever again. Over the next 900 years, Makashi would in essence go dormant within the Jedi, as anyone who practiced the duelist form was basically making a statement that they intended to fight other lightsaber wielders, thus painting a target on their back because they would be under heavy watch and scrutiny from the Jedi Council. The exact same thing that happened to a young DOOKU when he decided to train in the form. But why did DOOKU choose this? DOOKU was introduced to Form 2 lightsaber combat as a Padawan. As a young man, he was always far different from the other students, considered by many as an outsider. Although DOOKU had been taken from his home and was not raised as a count, refinement was in his blood. It was who he was. He was known as precise and pristine. His uniform and bedding were always immaculate. He walked with regality, even as a very young boy. DOOKU was special, and he knew it. Because of this, the other students despised him, deeming him arrogant, believing that DOOKU thought that he was better than them, which of course he did. DOOKU had ambition, and he was unapologetically competitive. DOOKU was bullied, but it never really bothered him because he knew that it stemmed from a place of jealousy and inferiority. Form 2 was attractive to DOOKU because he was already a contrarian. Makashi was elegant, precise, and perfectly suited for how DOOKU thought of himself. Not to mention, the lure of dominating a single opponent in combat spoke to his competitive nature. It was just another way to prove his superiority over his peers. DOOKU believed that Form 2 was pure. Many Jedi believed that he was too oriented on combat. This caused Yoda to take DOOKU as an apprentice personally. Yoda is one of the few individuals that DOOKU would listen to, the greatest duelist the Jedi had ever seen. But still, throughout all of this training, DOOKU was loyal to Form 2. DOOKU believed that his focus on the lightsaber was a statement and a testament to the Jedi's devotion to peace and security through superior force. DOOKU would even overcome the weaknesses of the form, as he learned to deflect blaster fire, even with the curved tilt design of his lightsaber that he specialized in, a weapon meant to give him a superior angle in one-on-one combat. He could deflect blaster fire better than anybody else, and in the end, DOOKU despised the practice and devotion of multiple forms, believing that if somebody wanted to become a true master of the blade, one form is all they needed. It was because of his fascination with a dueling-centric form that nearly no Jedi during the Clone Wars could ever raise a successful blade to him. He was simply better than them. One-on-one, he could butcher any Jedi, save it for Skywalker or Yoda. The other Jedi were inferior. And in the end, many of the same reasons why Makashi called to DOOKU are the same reasons that the dark side would. Resolvement of conflict through superior force, and a feeling of superiority overall.
But anyway, my
was
friend.
the renowned leader of the separatist movement and hero of the Confederacy. He served as a noble general and fierce combatant throughout the course of the entirety of the Clone Wars. At his disposal, he commanded an entire armada of droid soldiers, as well as controlled countless systems from which he could mine resources, manpower, and any other armament that could further the separatist cause. Perhaps his greatest asset was that of General Grievous, notorious warlord turned cybernetic Jedi butcher, and one of the most dangerous separatist weapons that the Sith had to wield during the Clone Wars conflict. Despite his admirable affinity for killing Jedi, and besting even the most well-trained combatants in single duels, what did Dooku actually think of General Grievous on a personal level? Why did he have such a disdain for perhaps the Separatist greatest asset? And why was Grievous looked down upon so much by Dooku? As well as specifically, what did Dooku think of Grievous's practice of collecting dead Jedi lightsabers? Well, stick with us today, students of the Force, and let's dive into Dooku's accounts and true thoughts as they pertain to General Grievous. Grievous's methods, practices, and traditions that Dooku saw as irksome at best and downright disrespectful or heinous at the worst. One of Count Dooku's proudest achievements and his crown jewel was his utter mastery of the lightsaber, becoming debatably the greatest duelist that his generation of Jedi had ever seen, as he sported with him an illustrious and accomplished career. Dooku was able to contend with Grandmaster Yoda for a short period of time, dueling him to a standstill at an astonishing 80 years of age, and was said to only be surpassed by Mace Windu, although this was debatable and has a lot of ambiguity surrounding who was truly the better duelist. There is no doubt that Dooku in his prime was one of the most formidable single duelists that the Jedi Order had ever produced, and his affinity for saber combat was second to none at the height of his power and physical capabilities. This mastery took decades of intense training and discipline, not to mention the countless adventures he had both to undertake as a Jedi Master, as well as during his time as a Sith Lord. Seeing the Jedi of the modern Clone Wars era swing their lightsabers like blunt instruments and relying on brutality over grace and dexterity annoyed Dooku to no end, as he believed newer Jedi lacked the precision and grace of old lightsaber combat, seeing it as a means to an end rather than an art form to be practiced, mastered, and respected. He had a particular disdain for the practice of wielding multiple lightsabers, and often critiqued Jedi who used 2 or more lightsabers, such as we see with General Grievous. Grievous, who was a non-force sensitive, untrained brute force warlord wielding 4 lightsabers at once, caused Dooku to feel immense disdain and disrespect for his subordinate. No matter how effective these barbaric tactics may have been against Jedi, Count Dooku abandoned the ways of the Jedi due to their dogma and political stance within the galaxy, not due to his disagreement with the Jedi ways on a philosophical and moral level. He still had an immeasurable respect for the sacred bond between the Jedi and their lightsaber, as well as the nature of the Force and its position as an unbiased entity who served only to obtain balance. This meant that Grievous's affinity for collecting lightsabers was one of the most egregious disservices to the Jedi arts that Dooku had ever seen, and the individual to disrespect Dooku so vehemently was not only his own subordinate, but did not possess any gifts of the Force. If Dooku had still served the Order of the Light and learned of Grievous, he would most likely want to destroy the general himself to make right the desecration of his sacred ways. As a Sith Lord though, Dooku not only had to live with the existence of such a creature, but had to actively command Grievous across the battlefield against his former Jedi friends and colleagues who he still cared for on some distant level. To put things quite plainly, Dooku was absolutely disgusted with General Grievous's practice of collecting dead Jedi's lightsabers. But on top of this, Dooku also had an avid disdain for cybernetic enhancements as a fundamental principle, regardless of who practiced with one. Dooku was on record as believing that even Anakin's robotic hand was a disgrace to the Jedi ways, and he believed that a true gentleman and honorable warrior would learn to duel with a single hand. In Dooku's eyes, the Jedi ways were still sacred for numerous reasons, and he wanted nothing more than to respect what the Jedi had once been. Even if the current era must crumble, he only wanted to dismantle the current organization so that he could rebuild it back to its former glory, only now aligned with the Sith, getting rid of the political biases and governmental involvement that had long since corrupted what had been a sacred order of unbiased, noble peacekeepers. Dooku now believed, though, in peace through domination. Grievous, however, was an absolute abomination in every way conceivable. and Dooku resented the fact that he had to work with such a disgrace to the beliefs that he had held so dear. Not only did he annihilate the relationship and sacred bond that each Jedi had with their weapon, but he was an ill-trained barbarian who had no concept of how to use the weapons in the first place. Grievous's style was to overwhelm an opponent with a barrage of brutal strikes, breaking down a Jedi's defenses with violence and aggression, which required no skill nor finesse. Instead, it just took immense strength and speed, which Grievous himself did not inherently possess either. Grievous's strength and speed could be directly attributed to his cybernetic enhancements, which were the only reason he could keep up with a Jedi in the first place. He was not force sensitive, he was not naturally as fast as a Jedi, nor was he naturally as strong as the gifts of the Force. He had no concept on how to properly wield a lightsaber, nor did he have any respect for the blade itself, and his inclusion into the Separatist movement was strictly due to Dooku's lack of resources. In essence, Dooku turned to Grievous out of sheer necessity, not because he had any respect for the monster, nor did he have any desire to work with Grievous for any other reason than to attain victory. But this is what he had at his disposal. At first, Dooku attempted to teach Grievous the intricacies of lightsaber combat, showing him proper form and footwork to a degree that was largely successful in fact. This allowed Grievous to grasp a fundamental understanding of proper lightsaber forms, and he used this to enhance his style. But graduating to a degree wherein Grievous could take on multiple trained knights at once should have taken decades of intense training and practice, not just a few short months. Dooku had to watch Grievous build more skill and notoriety in just 3 years than Dooku had obtained over a lifetime of training. And while Dooku could fight off multiple Jedi Knights at once, he was still nowhere near obtaining the same level of bloodshed and veracity that Grievous had become known for. This is of course not to say that Grievous is necessarily more skilled in lightsaber combat than Dooku, as Dooku was still a superior duelist in just about every single way. But the idea that Grievous could become this skilled in such a short amount of time felt like cheating to the Count. This is especially prevalent because Dooku rarely ever engaged in lightsaber combat during the Clone Wars, which is the primary reason why he didn't slaughter nearly as many Jedi as Grievous, as Dooku took on a more political leadership role and only resorted to combat when absolutely necessary. Grievous, however, was consistently on the front lines with his sole purpose being combat and the decimation of Jedi, and this helped to augment a reputation that Dooku felt he did not formally earn. But anyway, my friends, curious acolytes of the galaxy, and welcome back to our archives. We've been expecting you. Darth Tyrannus Count Dooku is one of the most classic hero-turned-villain characters, who unfortunately gets overshadowed by the likes of Anakin and his story. On analyzing Dooku's life, we will find that he bears many similarities to the likes of Skywalker, which we talked about in a video recently as we described the complexity of Dooku's character. But even though he only joined the Sith to supposedly save the galaxy, one will find quite the contrary when analyzing all of his various deeds and crimes. During his tenure as a Sith Lord as well as a Separatist leader, Dooku committed an insane amount of scandalous crimes against people and against morality in general that would force one to question if Dooku ever truly was a good person. While we do know that he genuinely believed that he was doing what was better for the galaxy as a whole, the dark side corrupts all good intentions, and before he knew it, Dooku was just as horrifically cruel as the people he was trying to save the galaxy from. Therefore, we have decided to compile a list of some of the worst acts that Dooku ever committed. Since it is difficult to say which of these are worse than the other, we have decided to make a tier list, starting with more personal transgressions and ending on galactic-wide crimes. So, grab your holopads and find somewhere comfortable, as it is time to begin. Starting with Tier 1, our first mention is that of his betrayal of his best friend, Jedi Master Sifo Dyas. When reading novels such as Darth Plagueis, you will find that Dooku and Sifo Dyas were actually very close friends, and they had similar ideas about the state of the galaxy. According to the canon novel Dooku Jedi Lost, he and Sifo Dyas had been friends since they were younglings, having been placed in the same clan. As a Jedi Master, Sifo Dyas began having visions of the coming war, the Clone Wars, and began to grow a bit paranoid. Foreseeing an upcoming full-scale conflict, he started to advocate for the creation of an army for the Republic to use. The rest of the Jedi High Council deemed his ideas too extreme, and Sifo Dyas was removed from his position as a council member. In Legends, we find out that Plagueis himself, under the guise of the banking leader Higo Damask, convinced the unnerved Jedi Master to create the army in secret. As for Dooku, rather than perhaps just working with Sifo Dyas, he was just used to orchestrate the clone army, and then he used the pikes to kill Sifo Dyas Sidious his own friend, ultimately betraying his best friend in all of his life since childhood. Even though Dooku advocated for never to killing a Jedi directly, any Jedi by his own hand for that matter, he still did so, and he has an impressive 5 Jedi kills in single combat, including most recently the likes of Jedi Master Yaddle, who was only trying to help him. But as you know, he is far more responsible for much more Jedi deaths indirectly. On Geonosis, Dooku watched as swaths of Jedi that he knew were gunned down by the newly manufactured droid army. Then, immediately afterwards, he almost killed a downed Obi-Wan Kenobi in cold blood had Anakin not stopped him. Over the course of the Clone Wars, Dooku became more and more cruel, and towards the end of the war itself, Dooku does something to a Jedi that is arguably worse than just outright killing him. In the novel Dark Disciple, Ventress and Quinlan Vos team up to assassinate Dooku. Over the course of their friendship, it turns to romance, and Ventress convinces Quinlan to use the dark side. Soon, they both face Dooku, but the assassination was a complete failure, and Ventress was forced to flee, while Vos was captured by Darth Tyrannus. In the subsequent months, Dooku would torture the Jedi Master in all ways possible, even convincing him that Ventress used him, and that she had abandoned him on purpose. Soon, Quinlan was released, but his mind had been so twisted by Dooku that he was now his full-blown apprentice. Dooku commanded Vos to return to the Jedi Temple on an undercover mission. However, the Jedi were suspicious of Quinlan and followed him back to Dooku's separatist command ship. There, an epic fight ensued. At the same time, Ventress had also shown up to get Quinlan Vos back. During the fighting, Dooku killed Ventress in front of Quinlan before escaping. The grieved Quinlan Vos was convinced to return to the Jedi, and after some containment and therapy, he was back to the light side. However, the scars of Dooku torturing him and then killing his lover right before his eyes would always remain. For the final spot in Tier 1, we have the events of the Clone Wars as well as the Clone Wars movie, where Dooku captured Jabba's infant son and tried to blame it on the Jedi in order to bring Jabba on the side of the Separatist Alliance. Not only was Jabba's son in terrible conditions when Anakin and Ahsoka found him in his cell, but Dooku ordered Ventress to kill the child to fully convince Jabba to join him. Ventress failed, and when the two Jedi arrived back on Tatooine to return Rada to Jabba, Dooku came to face them personally. Luckily, Anakin and Ahsoka had some brilliant thinking, and Anakin filled the backpack that he had been carrying Rada with rocks, while Ahsoka actually took the child and went on a different route. However, Dooku didn't know this and dueled Anakin in the desert, finishing the duel by slicing the backpack. Even though all that he struck was rocks, the point remains that he believed and fully intended to slay an infant with his lightsaber, and was gloating after he did so. Hut or not, a baby is a baby, and that if this isn't truly dark side in orientation, I don't know what is. Moving on to Tier 2, we go a little darker. We're going to talk about the Clone Wars Season 4 story arc that begins with Episode 11, Kidnapped. The events of this episode are less important than why we are actually mentioning it, which is that Dooku sold out the entire Togrutan population to Zygerian slavers. Even though the plan was ultimately thwarted by the Republic Task Force, it was under Dooku's orders that the Separatists aid the Zygerians in literally enslaving an entire population. I think that this is such a horrific act and is compounded by the fact that Dooku was angry with the Jedi for allowing slavery on Tatooine to run unchecked. Hypocritically, here Dooku is now selling out an entire population to slavery in a war effort. Talk about becoming the very thing you swore to destroy. Even Darth Vader didn't have anything to do with slaves. Speaking of entire populations, we aren't just going to brush over the fact that Count Dooku sent General Grievous, along with a huge droid army, to literally commit genocide on the Night Sister Coven. After their repeated attempts to kill Dooku, Dooku seemed to finally have enough and ordered their total annihilation. Upon Maul's return to Dathomir, he would be welcomed by a wasteland of corpses, and even Mother Talzin was barely alive, floating from the nether regions, now only present in some incorporeal form. Dooku may have despised Grievous, but he certainly used him like a mad dog on a leash, pointing him towards a target and then taking off the chain. Dooku did this with Dathomir, and the results were catastrophic. Now I know that the Night Sisters themselves aren't exactly the paragon of innocence, but again, mass genocide is not something that a sane person would condone under any circumstances. Speaking of mass genocide, we must begin Tier 3 with the creation of the Clone Army and the accomplice to Order 66. Make no mistake, Dooku was fully aware of the inhibitor chips placed in the clones' minds, and knew exactly what their true purpose was. All of Dooku's talk about just Martynas wanting to get the Jedi to stop dying for political reasons. This seems like a far cry from his original plans, and a far fall for this Jedi Master. Dooku knew from the very beginning that the clones were capable of this, and despite showing remorse for betraying the Jedi, he was still completely willing to allow Sidious to execute Order 66. Count Dooku was fully prepared to stand by and watch as everything he grew up knowing and cared about was blasted to oblivion all across the stars. It was actually under his watch that the clone army was even created. The further down this list we go, the less I'm feeling bad for his ultimate death at the hands of Anakin, and the true evil man that Dooku became. However, it is debatable that this is just as bad as the final thing we will mention in today's tier list. Dooku was a catalyst for the creation of none other than the Death Star. While Dooku may not have been around to see the battle station in fully operational form, we know for certain that he was in the know about it. In Attack of the Clones on Geonosis, we can see that Dooku had a hologram blueprint of the Death Star, and he was also overseeing the Geonosians who were beginning their construction of it. The original plans of the Death Star were actually designed by the Geonosian and Poggle the Lesser, as overseen directly by Dooku. After the first battle of Geonosis, Dooku escaped with the plans to the Death Star and presented them to Darth Sidious for safekeeping. After the second battle of Geonosis, Sidious would actually begin the first bits of the construction of the Death Star, but progress was slow and they had to keep it hidden from the Republic. After the rise of the Empire, Galen Erso would make so much needed modifications that progress accelerated at a massive rate, as he basically overhauled the project before the real construction began. Back to Dooku though, not only was he in the know about Order 66, but also the creation of this ultimate weapon, a weapon that had the ability to wipe out an entire planet, a prospect he apparently was completely fine with. Because of Dooku, the Death Star plans were given to Sidious, making Dooku responsible for the deaths of millions or billions, as well as the destruction of the entire world of Alderaan. Count Dooku's death tolls reach unimaginable heights, and good intentions or not, there is just no denying that when he became a Sith Lord, Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, is responsible for some of the worst atrocities seen in the entirety of even the Sith Order. Dooku's death tolls would actually exceed that of Darth Bane himself, and many other prominent Sith from the past. Tales of the Jedi has done something that was very much needed for on-screen Star Wars, in that it outwardly shows the bigotry and corruption that has progressively grown in the Jedi Order, like a bad mold. The prequel movies show us in more subtle ways how the Jedi, specifically the High Council, had become rigid and stale, stuck in their old ways and believing that it was their judgment which held precedent over anything and anyone else. All the while, they were placating to the Republic politics and became like the Senate's lapdogs. A harsh explanation, but a necessary one. We see a lot of this in Revenge of the Sith as well as the Clone Wars, but only Tales of the Jedi has truly shown the Jedi for what they have become. Heretofore, the corruption of the Jedi has been mostly something that has been explored in the comics and the novels, with only a few hints in what is happening on the big screen. The most we got of this topic was in the Clone Wars arc where Ahsoka was on the run. However, I am super glad that we have an overt representation of exactly how far the Jedi have fallen, with it being the primary focus of Dooku's story arc in Tales of the Jedi, and how they interconnect with one another. There is, however, one story that I solely wish had been put on the screen in the Clone Wars story arc, that being the story told in the novel Dark Disciple, which is the topic of today's video, and how the Jedi Council themselves fell in the deepest pits of revenge and signaled their imminent demise, specifically revolving around the former Jedi Dooku and his assassination. The main plot of Dark Disciple is that Quinlan Vos is given a very concerning mission, which is to assassinate Count Dooku. Assassination seems like something that is beneath the Jedi, especially how they preach themselves to be in the Clone Wars. I find this specific story arc to be one of the most egregious transgressions committed by the Jedi High Council. Their reasoning was that Count Dooku had simply grown out of control and needed to be stopped, even if that meant his death. The Council believed that it was the only way to end the war. They had given the task to Jedi Master Quinlan Vos, who was very experienced with covert missions and was a rather fine combatant himself. able to contend maybe with Dooku on his best day. The story plays out that Quinlan Vos tracks down Asajj Ventress and gets in good terms with her so that he can gain more information on his target and hunt down Dooku in the process. However, Ventress finds out that he is a Jedi, but accepts his mission to kill Count Dooku nonetheless. However, Ventress convinces him that he needs the dark side in order to truly kill and conquer Dooku, Darth Tyrannus. Long story short, Quinlan Vos turns to the dark side, but butchers the assassination attempt and fails completely, as he ends up captured by Dooku and made into his would-be apprentice, subjugated and enslaved, tortured even by the dark side itself. Anyway, the point of this isn't the wider story, but mostly the mission itself taken upon by the Jedi Council and given to Quinlan Vos. The fact that the Jedi High Council stooped as low as commissioning an assassination, which resulted in one of their own turning to the dark side. The very fact of wishing to kill someone is, in itself, a notion bred by the dark side. One would think that the Jedi High Council would recognize this pattern of thinking, which led them to a very dark place. In our opinions, this is the greatest indicator that the Jedi of the Clone Wars needed to be destroyed. The Clone Wars had a tremendous impact on the Jedi Order as a whole, as it echoed back nearly 1,000 years prior, where General Hoth's Army of Light faced off against Lord Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness. In this war, specifically the 7th Battalion of Ruusan, the two sides began to meld and become intertwined. The lines between the light and dark side blurred as the war dredged on. The two sides were weary, and the Jedi were cutting moral corners and taking easy ways out. Jedi General Hoth himself was teetering dangerously on the edge of falling to the dark side. It was only after the detonation of the thought bomb on behalf of Bane and the subsequent Ruusan reformation that brought the Jedi Order back into the fold and back into one center. We did a video sometime back asking the question of if the Old Republic Jedi were actually worse than the Clone Wars Jedi. Well, we can bring those points up again here, as it seems that anytime the Jedi become militarized, it does a great deal of harm to everyone. Very few points in galactic history has Jedi military ever been a good thing, even though it was very necessary at the time. Revan and Malak's army resulted in them and their followers cutting moral corners, and we saw where that led them. Revan wanted to finally end the Mandalorian Wars with the weapon known as the Mass Shadow Generator, extinguishing tens of thousands of lives in half a second. In the War of Light and Darkness, General Hoth was to the point of having to buff his ranks with Padawans because he was running out of knights, and no other Jedi wanted to join the army, forcing Hoth to literally use child soldiers. It almost got to this point in the Clone Wars as well. The Ruusan Reformation saw that the Army of Light was disbanded, and that the Jedi Order would not be able to organize into military ever again. The Reformation also saw to it that the Republic itself would no longer hold an organized military, leaving each individual system to delegate their own planetary security force. Surprisingly, the Ruusan Reformation proved to be a stroke of fortune, as the 1,000 years that followed would surmise into the High Republic era, where the Jedi finally had their place as peacekeepers and guardians in the truest sense restored. However, once the Clone Wars was thrust upon them by Darth Sidious and the Separatists, they were forced to renounce the Ruusan Reformation and take on the Grand Army of the Republic and go to war. We can see the impact of this and what it had on the Jedi Order, and their thought processes regressed even further until they got to the point where they actually decided to move forward with the literal assassination of Count Dooku, with this marking the truest extent of how far the Jedi fell. Quinlan Vos's fall to the dark side feels a bit sudden to me. However, upon analyzing the Dark Disciple novel further, I've come to the conclusion that this perfectly represents the attitude of the Jedi by this year in the war. It is this exact moment where the Jedi decide to assassinate Dooku, where they have gone beyond a point of no return. They were willing to do whatever it took to win, no matter the cost, no matter the code. They wanted to shoot first and pick up the pieces later. So of course, Vos is going to take the path that leads him to victory and accomplishment fastest. It's the only thing he's been doing for the entirety of the Clone Wars. By this point in the timeline, the Jedi have completely lost themselves, and unfortunately, barely anyone, not even Obi-Wan Kenobi, is exempt from this process. Even Obi-Wan Kenobi, who is usually the symbol of what we think of a Jedi should be, but in the latter hours of the Clone Wars, he too becomes short-sighted for a while and this becomes apparent when he receives a seat on the Jedi High Council. Remember that it was Obi-Wan that convinced Anakin to spy on the Chancellor on behalf of the Council, and it was Obi-Wan that endorsed the assassination of Count Dooku, despite even admitting that he felt it was a bit extreme. Nevertheless, he gave Quinlan Vos tips on how to flirt with and even deceive Ventress, which ended up backfiring as the two fell in love. It's hard to resist the temptation to give Obi-Wan the excuse of the exemption, but we saw some of the worst Clone Wars and what it had done as he was on the front lines, leading the 212th Battalion. Even Obi-Wan Kenobi had been corrupted by the Clone War. Dooku had done some terrible things, but assassination should have been above the Jedi, especially the High Council. However, this just goes to show that even the most devoted to the ideals of the light side of the Force can fall when surrounded by oppressive darkness and confusing times. Unfortunately, ordering Dooku's death all went to prove his point all along, in the fact that the Jedi had been destroyed, and upon ordering that Dooku should be no more, his turn was cemented, the Jedi Council's defeat was cemented, and without them even knowing, the Clone Wars came to an end. Well, my friends, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to let us know if you like these more casual discussion type videos. Also, do you agree with our assessment that assassination is the unbecoming final downfall of the Jedi? We do know that there was a group of Jedi Sentinels known as the Jedi Shadows, which did go out on secret missions to eradicate all traces of the dark side. However, this is more like overt, politically motivated, cold assassination when concerning Dooku, and may be considered different. Until next time, my friends.
Throughout the course of his life, Emperor Palpatine has seldom been significantly challenged in either the political arena or the field of physical combat, as his skills in both corners are largely unmatched to this day. As the greatest rival to the Jedi Order, a gifted manipulator and talented duelist, his greatest fears and most dire threats to his rule could often be addressed by his own incredibly diverse skill set. Political rivals that stood in his way could be manipulated, much like how he had Chancellor Valorum removed from office to make way for his own election. And in the arena of combat, even the most gifted warriors would fall victim to his blade, leaving Sidious seemingly utterly undefeatable. Throughout the war, he balanced each of these skills with precision and grace, giving off an aura of invincibility. So then, this raises an important question. Why did he come to fear one particular individual who had formerly served as his greatest asset? Who could cause Palpatine to grow weary and cautious during the dying days of the Republic despite him having all of the power he could need to defend himself? Well, today, students of the Force, let's dive into why Palpatine grew fearful of none other than his very own apprentice, former Jedi Master Dooku. First though, according to our records, many of the Force attuned that have visited our archives have not yet joined our order. So if you've been enjoying the daily openings of holocrons, be sure to reach out and Force crush that subscribe button. Now, let us begin. Recently, we released and produced a video on why Darth Sidious feared Qui-Gon more than any other Jedi. But while Qui-Gon Jinn was the greatest threat that the Republic could offer him, his fear of Dooku was driven for very different reasons. We do encourage you to check out our video on why Palpatine feared Qui-Gon though, but let's discuss why his fear for Dooku was so different than this. This fear first arose when the Clone Wars first began. After Darth Sidious ultimately caught word that Dooku was able to duel Master Yoda in Attack of the Clones to a standstill on Geonosis, while Dooku ultimately had to endanger the lives of Obi-Wan and Anakin in order to escape the wrath of the Grand Master. The duel was fairly even throughout the course of its duration, and there was no overtly clear victor. He was able to keep pace with the Grand Master of the Jedi Order despite crossing 80 years of age when this duel took place. And although Dooku did not outright defeat Yoda, this was still an incredibly formidable feat of power, one that Darth Sidious noted carefully. At the time, Sidious was considered to be the most powerful Sith Lord that had ever existed in Star Wars history, but he had yet to test his skills against Yoda in physical combat, or any Jedi of note for that matter. It wasn't until the Clone Wars commenced that he began dueling more regularly, defeating Savage Opress and Darth Maul on Mandalore, and facing off against Mace Windu and Yoda as the Clone Wars came to an inevitable close, just to name a few notable duels. In truth, Darth Sidious never believed that he would ever truly need his lightsaber all that much, and was far more focused on his gifts that could be attuned to him through the dark side, rather than skill with a blade. However, hearing that his apprentice was able to stand his ground against one of the best Jedi duelists of the era
era, and possibly in galactic history, was incredibly alarming to Sidious, and it caused him to reconsider his own abilities as a duelist and the very distinct possibility of DOOKU overwhelming him with the blade. Many of the Jedi did not stand up to Sidious's prowess in lightsaber combat, but his true threat to the Jedi Order lay in his manipulation tactic, meaning that he didn't need to be better than most Jedi in lightsaber combat, although he wanted to be. For the duration of the Clone Wars, Sidious did not need to fight Jedi in single combat simply because he had already manipulated the war to his liking, and even if Windu had killed him, he still would have eradicated most of the Jedi, rupturing to the brink of collapse regardless of whether or not Sidious lived or died. DOOKU, however, stood in a very precarious position in regards to Sidious, as he was one of the only individuals to have direct contact with the Sith Lord, while still full well knowing that Palpatine was the Dark Lord of the Sith, the Chancellor, and the creator of the war. This meant that now, in addition to political leverage, DOOKU also had physical power over his master. DOOKU, as the public face of the Separatist movement, had all the political influence that he needed over the Confederacy, commanding the droid army at will and gaining the public support of these systems who followed him devoutly. Sidious, however, was not a public face of the Separatist movement, and his political influence was only applicable to the Republic, a republic which he was about to crumble. As for the Separatists, Sidious could only speak through DOOKU and had no direct power, meaning that his manipulation tactics wouldn't work on the Separatists without DOOKU's assistance and being the voice. And furthermore, it meant that if DOOKU ever decided to turn on Sidious, he would have to fall back on his prowess in lightsaber combat, something that he had always assumed would help him defeat his aging apprentices. Before the duel between DOOKU and Yoda on Geonosis, Darth Sidious believed that he was the clear better of DOOKU and Yoda at the same time, however he was more unsure about the Grand Master. This is why it was so shocking for the Sith when DOOKU met Yoda on even ground. While he knew that DOOKU had once been a paragon of the Jedi Order and one of their most talented swordsmen, he also had reason to believe that DOOKU could no longer achieve this height of his former glory in his age. After abandoning the ways of the Jedi to attend to matters on Sereno and learning the ways of the dark side combined with his advanced age, it stands to reason that DOOKU's political power would be seen as more dangerous than his physical power. But now DOOKU had both. Sidious always believed that DOOKU was a feared combatant and was more than capable to dispatch nearly any Jedi of the Order. Again though, Yoda was different. Upon discovering that he had nearly defeated Yoda, Sidious's entire worldview was brought into question, and Sidious was left to wonder whether or not he could actually defeat DOOKU as easily as he had formerly believed. This innate uncertainty was also augmented by the inclusion of Asajj Ventress to the battlefield, as DOOKU took to training this gifted Sith assassin as his own. As the war waged on, DOOKU and Ventress began to build a personal connection to one another, which soon began to resemble the very same relationship that he had once shared with Maul all those years ago. Contrary to popular belief, Darth Maul was actually taken under Sidious's wing while his own master Darth Plagueis was still alive, under the guise that Maul would be used as a public assassin and field operative, while the two true Sith Lords remained relegated to the shadows. Maul was expected to be a field agent in order to preserve the identities of Sidious and Plagueis, acting as a red herring for the Jedi Order and a scapegoat if anything were to go wrong. However, Sidious's plan changed, and upon assassinating Darth Plagueis, he had the idea of promoting Maul to his formal Sith apprentice. However, this would never happen, as Darth Maul being cut in half by a Padawan Obi-Wan and Darth Plagueis' death were nearly at the same time. These same characteristics, though, began to surface with DOOKU and Ventress, which was a clear red flag that Palpatine immediately recognized, and was the driving force behind his directive that DOOKU should kill Ventress. By driving a wedge between them, he stalled DOOKU from potentially overthrowing him until the war was over, though he still could not be certain. While we know that Sidious was a match for Yoda, and even won their duel in the Senate chambers, he still did not know this for certain until the time eventually arose for him to test his skills against the Jedi Grand Master. He believed his talent to be equal to Yoda, if not better, but this was still strictly hypothetical following DOOKU's duel with his former master. In fact, even though Sidious formally won the confrontation in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, he had to put his lightsaber away in order to defeat Yoda, meaning that many of Sidious's fears were actually correct, and that DOOKU may very well could have been the superior duelist to Sidious, and may have even gotten lucky. DOOKU again was far too close to the plan of Darth Sidious, and when he saw that DOOKU could meet Yoda on even ground, this struck him with intense fear. In the end though, what Sidious ultimately predicted would come true, and Dooku grew tired and weakened by the culmination of the Clone Wars, ultimately leaving the door open for Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, to defeat Dooku in single combat as he grew tired and weary. Something that many people fail to note about Dooku is that he is clearly far more powerful in Attack of the Clones than he is in Revenge of the Sith, as is dictated by the Revenge of the Sith novelization. And even Yoda senses this same change in his former apprentice in Dooku as the war wages on. As Anakin increases in power, Dooku decreases, and it is clear that Sidious's goals will still be maintained as he can now clearly overthrow Dooku in single combat. This doesn't change though the fear that he had for his apprentice for some time following the events of Attack of the Clones. But now my new signature form of Vaapad took what was traditionally dark side lightsaber style of Form 7 and flipped it on its head, making it serve the light instead. Windu so far is the only one to have perfected Vaapad without turning to the dark side, making him a distinctly formidable fighter when facing opponents who possess great darkness within them. In many circles of scholars who study a galaxy far, far away, there is a great debate on the outcome of a duel between Windu and Dooku. Both of them are exceptionally talented duelists, but Count Dooku is on record of saying that the blade sequences of Vaapad are sloppy, indicating that at least for him, he believes himself to be more than a match for the style. This is a hot point of contention, as many believe that Windu would be able to take on Dooku on a level of power, while others believe that Dooku's superior skill and experience would win the day. While we here at the Archives may not be able to put a definitive end to this debate, we have a theory in which we believe that Vaapad and its style may actually not be as effective against Dooku as many believe. We know that we will need to defend this stance pretty well, so let's begin. Before we start though, we are always accepting suggestions for more topics to produce holocrons for, so if you'd like to get in with the Archives, be sure to subscribe and comment down below what kind of topics you want to see explored. Now, let's begin. First, we need to lay out all the facts about Vaapad and get a clear idea of how it works, and then compare it directly to Dooku. Vaapad is the secret Jedi variant of the 7th form of lightsaber combat, originally known as Juyo. In its base form, Form 7 is considered completely forbidden for any Jedi below the rank of Master to train in, and even then, most Masters refuse to learn its sequences because of what the form requires them to sacrifice. Like many forms, Juyo has a specific trait which makes it quite unique. This trait happens to be the fact that it requires the user to draw upon their aggressive feelings and give in to pure emotion. Juyo is wild, aggressive, and entirely unpredictable. In motion, Juyo is described as being like a river. Many seemingly unconnected moves come together to form a cohesive, deadly sequence. The form manifests as sharp and chaotic bursts of motion and is extremely difficult to fight against. It is said that a Juyo master can even break the impenetrable defenses of a Sarisu practitioner. Though Sidious was well versed in all 7 forms of lightsaber combat, we do know that he particularly preferred Form 7 due to how nicely it complements wielders of the darkness. Sidious is even known to have mentioned this specifically as a Sith form and not for the Jedi to use. Juyo is one form that cannot be simply studied, it has to be experienced and accepted. Even a Jedi Master once said that one can practice the sequences of Juyo, but will never become a master of the form until they give themselves over to the excitement and passion, 2 things which actively go against the very Jedi code. But this is where the brilliance of Vaapad begins. Vaapad is in effect the controlled and refined version of Juyo. With that said though, a lot more complicated. Rather than using his own passion, Windu developed a way to keep it locked away in a brewing storm. Using this, he also takes in his opponent's passion and darkness and allows it to conduct itself through him like a lightning rod, before letting it fountain back against his opponent, essentially forcing them to duel their own energy. Like how a lightsaber reflects blaster fire, so too does Vaapad reflect the dark using the light like a mirror. With that said though, the form is incredibly dangerous, as using one's passion to actually take darkness within themselves is incredibly deadly. It requires one step just close enough to the void without falling in. Unfortunately, only Mace Windu has ever succeeded in perfecting this mindset, and so he is the only one that used Vaapad that never fell to the dark side. The co-developer of Vaapad and another practitioner of the form Sora Bulk would ultimately come to its dark side effects. In the end, Sora Bulk's Vaapad was referred to by Mace Windu as only Juyo. In effect, a true Vaapad user was channeling his opponent's own dark side powers against them. The stronger someone is in the dark, and the less refined, the stronger Vaapad will be. This is why we see Sidious snarling and growling, frustrated while fighting Windu. He is so powerful in the dark side that Vaapad just keeps growing in scale alongside his own massive power. It's the first time that all of Sidious's strength is culminated against him, and it was extremely effective. So now, why would Vaapad not work against someone like Darth Tyrannus or DOOKU? Isn't DOOKU sufficiently strong enough in the dark side? Well, the answer is yes and no. DOOKU is a fully fledged Sith Lord after only a short time experiencing the dark side, since of course he had formal training as a Jedi and formal training within the Force. From the moment he left the Order to when he died, DOOKU was a Sith, and using the dark side for a total of more than 13 years, more than enough to become steeped in the dark side well. By the time Yoda faced him on Geonosis, which is likely around the time that Windu would have faced DOOKU, had he gotten the chance, Darth Tyrannus was already adept in using Force Lightning, and he was able to contend with Yoda in a feat of a lightsaber. But there's a bit of a problem here, as it seems almost as if DOOKU is holding back. Or rather, he isn't being as powerful as he could be. This is most certainly not to say that DOOKU isn't powerful. He was even commended for his increased power by Yoda. With that said though, DOOKU is no Sidious. Let's compare Force Lightning directly when talking about the differences between DOOKU and Sidious. We saw on Geonosis that Yoda was able to absorb Dooku's Force Lightning using Terminus, as well as Obi-Wan holding up his lightsaber and having the Force Lightning absorbed by the blade. Let's directly compare this to Sidious. Sidious is able to nearly overpower Yoda while Yoda is using Terminus, forcing the Grandmaster to use both hands. And later, when he is firing his Force Lightning at Windu is being pushed back actively, struggling at the insane dark power that Sidious wields. Some may say that this is because Sidious is known to be naturally gifted in Force Lightning. However, DOOKU is also stated to be naturally gifted. In canon, there are now many sources that explore DOOKU's early years. In fact, DOOKU even used Force Lightning as a Jedi Padawan, something that should not have been possible, even using it several times as a Jedi Master, at one point wielding Force Lightning to save a young Qui-Gon's life. There's no question about their talents, but still, others will say that Sidious is more experienced than DOOKU, having trained in the dark side for far longer. Well, consider this. In Attack of the Clones, Sidious is 54 years old and has been training in the dark side since he was around 20, around double the time that DOOKU had trained in the dark side. However, Sidious became a Sith and began training in the dark side of the Force from 20, having zero prior experience. DOOKU trained in the Force his entire life. Even with the time differences in dark side training, DOOKU still should have been able to pick up on it more quickly than even his master. All of this goes to say that DOOKU has not given himself over to the powers of the dark side on the same level of Sidious. With that said, that's not a knock against DOOKU. It's just a pure fact that essentially no one else has ever risen to the dark side power that Sidious has. He is the ultimate. But this is why Vaapad would be much weaker against DOOKU. It's true that he's cruel and full of anger, but although his intentions have been twisted, he still holds fast to his ideals. He avoided and almost refused to directly kill any Jedi for almost his entire time as a Sith. This goes to show that while he may use the dark side for the power it grants, he doesn't quite subscribe to the Sith ideology in all of its entirety. DOOKU does not go as far into the darkness as he could. This is something that is a generally accepted consensus, as we have done a holocron all about the characterization of DOOKU, where we explored all of his motives and his psychology. DOOKU brought with him many Jedi ideals when in combat, such as the way he suppressed his passion in fights with cold intent. He is measured, withheld, and calculated. DOOKU maintains being the finest duelist because he uses his Jedi ideals of combat, which is to remain calm, cleared, and focused. Luke Skywalker has even mentioned that he believes that Jedi are better duelists because of this. So how exactly would this affect Vaapad? If DOOKU is calm in battle and doesn't let his passion run rampant, then he also hasn't fully given himself over to the dark side. But now we ask you, what power
Many Sith that we know of revel in the fact that they are capable of killing Jedi, and jump at the opportunity to kill or fight a Jedi at a moment's notice. Maul wanted to prove his superiority to the Jedi because of his allegiance to the darkness, blaming them for not finding him as a young child, and saving him from the horrors that he would experience at the hands of Darth Sidious. Sidious himself despised the Jedi. In fact, after his empire rose, it was one of his favorite pastimes to watch Jedi fight each other in single combat, promising the winner that they would have a place among his new empire. However, every single time, Sidious would kill them on the spot, forcing them to first abandon their morals and their code, and then executing them, destroying the final thing that the Jedi had, their very life. Vader was one of the most famous Jedi killers of all time, blaming the Jedi for abandoning the way of the Republic, and abandoning the Republic that they swore to protect. In Vader's mind, the Jedi were utter traitors, and every Jedi deserved to die, no matter how young or seemingly innocent. This is what makes the Sith Lord that we'll be discussing today extremely interesting, his relationship with the Jedi especially. We're obviously talking about Darth Tyrannus, Count Dooku, the apprentice to Sidious over the Clone Wars conflict, and the predecessor to Lord Vader himself. Dooku had an interesting relationship with the Jedi, and it's very clearly stated that Dooku despised the upper orders of the Jedi, specifically again the Jedi Council and its leaders, such as Yoda and Mace Windu. Dooku's larger problem, however, was not actually with the Jedi Order, but it was with the Republic. Dooku himself explained that the reason that he was a Jedi for so long was that he believed that as a Jedi, he was the most influential being he could be in the galaxy at the time, and could do the most good for the Republic, seeding out all of the corrupt individuals that worked there, and that governed over the more innocent people. Dooku's true issue was again with the Republic, not the Jedi. He believed the Jedi were fools, but he did not outright wish to destroy them. This is why on multiple occasions we see Dooku attempting to shift Obi-Wan Kenobi over to his side, and over the Clone Wars, especially in Legends continuity, multiple times Dooku was seen attempting to sway Jedi Knights over to the path of the Separatists, and not outright killing them like his master would or later Vader would. But why exactly is this? Let's go a little bit more in depth, as Dooku's relationship with the Jedi is one of the most interesting in Star Wars that is only seldom touched upon. As stated, Dooku's real grievance was not really with the Jedi Order itself, but the Republic that they served, believing that in its purest form, at least initially, that the Jedi were a good force in the galaxy, only that they served a greater evil in the Republic. Eventually, Dooku believed that in order to stop this, he had to tear down the Republic entirely, joining the Sith and his master Palpatine, hoping that one day he could establish a brand new order in the Empire. A place where in Dooku's mind, the Jedi would actually have a role to play. Dooku was under the impression from his master that many of the Jedi would actually be allowed to join their cause after the Clone Wars ended, and after much of the Jedi Order had been decimated. It was never Count Dooku's desire or intention to carry out a full-fledged Jedi purge. In Dooku's mind, together with the help of his master, they would re-establish the Sith rule of one, all of the Sith bowing to one master, hopefully potentially one day Dooku himself, but established in a hierarchy where many Sith Lords would be welcomed, and many Jedi that Dooku perceived as misguided may be allowed to adopt the Order of the Sith as Dooku had, and not be killed, all of them having an important place in Palpatine's new empire. This was of course though a lie, and a ploy by Palpatine to sway Dooku to his side. Palpatine had no intention of offering any of the Jedi that managed to escape Order 66 a role in his new empire, or even more outlandishly, a role as a Sith Lord. Going on to further discuss Dooku's relationship with the Jedi, it is true that Dooku hated Yoda and Mace Windu, especially Yoda as he was the leader of the Jedi, and in many ways, Dooku blamed Yoda for the Clone Wars conflict, and for Yoda's compliance with the Republic that was now completely corrupt, something that Dooku did not understand, and did not understand how Yoda could turn a blind eye on all of the evil going on in the government that he served. He held the Jedi Council responsible for the sins of the Jedi. However, more common Jedi Knights, against at the time of Attack of the Clones such as Kenobi, he did not hold responsible. In fact, at many moments and scenarios during the Clone Wars, Dooku outright refused to kill Jedi that he had captured or defeated in combat. Although he absolutely would not hesitate to kill a clone trooper, the Jedi were different. Make no mistake though, Dooku was absolutely willing to kill a Jedi if he believed they would not turn to the dark side, but this was not often Dooku's first choice when faced with the situation. Instead, Dooku wanted to make a habit of sparing Jedi, making the Jedi question their very stance as Jedi Knights, and the Order and Republic that they serve, seeing a glimpse of kindness from the Separatist leader, even if this kindness was only meant as a manipulation tactic. This actually worked on several occasions, as by the end of the Clone Wars, Dooku had a small army of darkside acolytes comprised nearly completely of former Jedi that had grown sickened by the war crimes during the Clone Wars, coming to the conclusion that Dooku had as well, that the Republic must fall. Again, this is a relationship that I find really intriguing, because inherently, Dooku doesn't necessarily hate the Jedi Order. In reality, Dooku noticed just how much of his life he had dedicated to the Jedi Order and protecting the Republic, and he realized that many of the Jedi were misguided and wanted to offer them a second chance that his successor in Lord Vader never offered Jedi. The complete eradication of the Jedi Order was never on Dooku's agenda. That was his master's plan. Dooku required a greater destiny for the Jedi, and that is why he refused to kill many of them over the Clone Wars conflict. Something that Palpatine was fine with, as at the end of the day he knew that all of those that served Dooku, as well as Dooku himself, would one day be executed. It was never Palpatine's plan to have Dooku a part of his empire in the slightest. Dooku was a pawn and a means to an end, and those Jedi that served him as darkside acolytes were less than pawns. Anyway,
why exactly did Dooku hate Anakin so much, and in which conversation that Dooku had with Yoda did he break it down for the Grand Master? Greetings again, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to today's Holocron reading. One of the greatest villains of the Clone Wars was of course Count Dooku, the Jedi turned Sith that served as a political leader for the Separatist movement. Although Dooku wasn't publicly involved with the Separatist military, many knew that he was indeed pulling the strings behind it all. He would come into repeated conflict with the two main heroes of the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, many times over, beginning from their first interaction on Geonosis, and then several more subsequent times during the Clone Wars, until Dooku's eventual defeat on the Invisible Hand by the young Skywalker. While Dooku came into conflict with many Jedi during this time, it was Anakin who seemed to always be his main point of contention. Despite the Skywalker boy being no more than a Jedi Knight, Dooku was cursed with him having to continually run sabers with him at just about every turn in the road. As the war dredges on, it becomes painfully obvious that Count Dooku just absolutely hates Anakin with every fiber of his being. The feeling, of course, is mutual, as Anakin never forgave the Dark Lord for taking his arm. But it seems to be a bit odd that of all the Jedi, Dooku would hate Anakin the worst. But in this holocron, we are going to visit a secret conversation between Dooku and Master Yoda, one in which Dooku finally reveals why he hates Anakin so much. So, come along with us today, my friend, as we do another character dive into Darth Tyrannus, and uncover the truth behind this deep rivalry. Of all of the Jedi in the entire Order, it is certainly curious that Anakin would be the one to make Dooku feel so much hatred. One might think that place would belong to Obi-Wan, the single man who was a living memory of Qui-Gon Jinn and the failures of the Jedi. Or perhaps Dooku's hatred should lie with Yoda, Dooku's own former Jedi Master, whom he feels holds a great deal of responsibility for how the war has turned out. But instead, we can plainly see that Dooku just despises Anakin. In the now Legends novel Yoda Dark Rendezvous, we get a very interesting conversation between the Grand Master and the Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus. This is indeed the same conversation that ended with Yoda showing Dooku what would happen if he ever turned to the dark side. But during that very conversation, the two go on a bit on a tangent about Anakin, which reveals Dooku's true feelings of the Skywalker boy. The conversation goes as follows. Dooku is making threats to Yoda and ends by saying this: "It is possible that at a single word I could have you killed, and without you, how long would those dear to you last? I could have them one by one. Mace and Iron Hand, Obi-Wan, and the precious young Skywalker too. Surely you would feel safer if this were not so." Yoda responds by cocking his head to one side and simply asking, "Like Anakin, you do not." And finally, we get the quote that summarizes it all, as Dooku responds, "Perhaps he reminds me too much of myself at that age, arrogant and impulsive, proud. I realize humility is high among the enforced virtues, the ones no one acquires by choice. But that being said, if fate is looking for an instrument to humble Skywalker, I confess myself willing to volunteer." So there we have the quote. Now of course, let us analyze exactly what Dooku is saying. I would like to start with his surface level gripes with Anakin's character. Dooku despises Anakin's pride and arrogance for the most part. This is of course something we knew before, as when he faced off on the Invisible Hand, Anakin claims that his powers had doubled, and Dooku basically warns him and tells him that it is not his power that has doubled, but simply his pride, which would eventually lead to his harder downfall. Also, as a quick side tangent, many don't know what Dooku meant when he said, "Twice the pride, double the fall." This comes from an ancient proverb that says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." This phrase of course has been shortened in recent years to say, "Pride goes before the fall." So when Anakin says that his powers have doubled, Dooku responded with the signature phrase, further indicating how much he hated Anakin's arrogance. This also cleverly foreshadows how Anakin fails on Mustafar, when his arrogance causes him to leap right into Obi-Wan's waiting blade. It's almost fascinating to go back and watch how many times Dooku has actually warned Anakin about his pride in a backhanded way, and in a way that would have helped Anakin before he destroyed himself. Dooku tried to teach Anakin this lesson the hard way on Geonosis, but all that he did was serve to stoke the fires of Anakin's rage. Dooku has been, for the most part, trying to keep his contempt for Anakin on the down low, as he is aware that Skywalker is the ultimate prize of his master Sidious, and Dooku has received many instructions from the Sith Lord to ensure Anakin's safety during the Clone War, which included everything from holding Grievous back from getting to him before the time was right, to holding back when dueling Skywalker. Dooku absolutely hates this, because in his eyes, Anakin gets preferential treatment from both the Jedi and the Sith. He's allowed to go and do whatever he wants because he's the chosen one, and the one who will be the catalyst to bringing balance to the Force, or destroying the Jedi. Palpatine effectively controls the entire war around Anakin, waiting for the perfect time to make his move. And of course, he doesn't want his prize too damaged. The arm was enough to teach Anakin loss and get him on the path to the dark side, and a path to revenge. But Dooku wants more. Dooku wants blood. As he stated, "If fate is looking for an instrument to humble Skywalker, I confess myself willing to volunteer." The Count is so eager to put Anakin in his place that he can hardly stand himself. The sheer amounts of frustration that must build up every time they engage in a duel must be difficult to contain. Dooku knows full well that if he was allowed to unleash his full power, that he could absolutely decimate the Jedi Knight in a way where he would never recover, and then leave him alive to writhe in agony and realize just how far beyond him Dooku really was. Whether this is fact or true can be debated, as Dooku was forced to use his full skill on the Invisible Hand when he goaded Anakin to the dark side. But when we analyze this quote even further, it reveals something far deeper beneath the layers of Count Dooku. Dooku has also admitted at the very beginning that Anakin reminds him of himself at around the same age, confessing that it is for this reason that perhaps Dooku dislikes him. This is a curious statement, as one might think at first that if this were the case, Dooku might feel some sort of kindred spirit towards the young boy, and desire to take on a mentor role for his life. However, it is quite the opposite. When Dooku became a Sith, like all Sith, he had to destroy his former self and leave him behind. If Anakin reminded Dooku of his younger self, that would basically put Anakin as a living reminder of the man that Dooku used to be. The noble, strong, albeit naive Jedi that he once was, and that he altogether tried to destroy. This is perhaps one of those deep psychological moments where Anakin represents everything that Dooku hates about the Jedi, but most importantly, everything that Dooku hates about himself. His inner rage, and perhaps a secret self-hatred for betraying his Jedi brethren, manifests itself as a deep-seated desire to destroy Anakin. If you think about it, Dooku is on a path now that he believes he can never return from. He had killed so many of his Jedi brothers, and was working with a Sith Lord to ensure the total destruction of the Jedi Order, and the instatement of a tyrannical galactic regime in the Empire. This is compounded even further when Dooku's betrayal is rubbed in his face, as his Sith name literally means Darth Tyrannus, a name which itself is a dark omen of things to come. Dooku knows exactly why Palpatine wants Anakin. He knew about the whole plan with Order 66, and likely knew of Operation Nightfall as well. That being the case, Dooku was forced to watch in real time a mirror of his own descent into darkness and betrayal. If the Count truly hates himself for what he is doing to his Jedi brethren like the theory suggests, then that means that Dooku hates Anakin for a very deep reason. Anakin literally is Dooku as a younger self. He remembers all the pride that he had as a Jedi, all the arrogance that would lead him to taking the oath of the dark side. Dooku could be subconsciously desiring to humble Anakin before that also happens to him. There could be an inner turmoil in the Sith Lord, more conflict to his character than meets the eye. However, the state of denial that he keeps himself in won't allow him to be upfront about his feelings and just tell Anakin the truth. Count Dooku hates Anakin because he hates himself. But why was it that by the conclusion of the Clone Wars, Grandmaster Yoda wanted his former apprentice in Dooku to be killed? Why had Yoda finally had enough and believed this to be the best outcome? Greetings, acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. We've been expecting you. The fall of the great Jedi Master Dooku hit the Order hard and hit Grandmaster Yoda the hardest. Having trained the boy since he was merely a child, Yoda felt a special connection to him. When Dooku ultimately decided to leave the Order, Yoda made sure that a bust of him was made in order to induct him officially into the Lost 20. And Yoda may have actually mourned his leaving. But soon, it came to light that Dooku had joined the Separatists as their leading politician, which now put him in direct odds with the Jedi Order that now served the Republic's political interests. It wouldn't be until the Battle of Geonosis when Yoda would actually come face to face with his former apprentice yet again, where he would have a realization. Tragically, Yoda would sense the dark side inside of Dooku, and this confirmed the old master's worst fears that he had tried to ignore. His former apprentice was now a Sith Lord, and after this moment, Dooku might as well have been dead to the Grand Master. Yoda didn't want to consider him dead emotionally, he actually wanted him dead, literally. For a wise old Jedi Master that believes in the living Force, this seems like an awfully sharp contrast. But let's dive into Yoda's psyche and his thoughts concerning Dooku, and why he thought he should be put down. The evidence we have that supports Yoda's willingness to kill Dooku largely lies within the pages of the canon novel Dark Disciple, in which the Jedi Council signs off on a literal assassination contract against Dooku. In the novel, the finest undercover Jedi they have, Quinlan Vos, is selected by the High Council to track down Ventress and learn where Dooku is hiding, along with perhaps a secret weakness of his, trying to gain information on how to finally take out the Count. During this council meeting, they all appear to be rather grim about the subject, not having wanted to actually go down this route, especially with one of their own. As Anakin would say, it's not the Jedi way. Execution isn't to be exact. But with Dooku, this wasn't just an execution, it was outright assassination. What's shocking about this moment though, is during the meeting, Yoda was not apprehensive about this idea, despite it shocking Jedi Master Quinlan Vos. Though the Jedi Master seemed dully remorseful, he didn't at all appear as though he was sorry enough to not go through with this dark plan. And from what little we know about Yoda's reaction to Dooku's death, he was of course disappointed that it had to go down this road, but was not in the least bit regretful that Dooku met an ultimate demise at the business end of a lightsaber. Yoda has always shown himself to care about the living Force. The Force flows through, connects, and binds all things, especially those that are alive. It is a Jedi's sole duty to follow the will of the Force, and of course, as the Grand Master, Yoda has shown his ability to calmly navigate his way through situations where he is faced with an enemy, oftentimes without a lightsaber at all. This, of course, was a result of him being exemplary as a Jedi, but when it came to his old apprentice in Dooku, Yoda was all business right from the start. The moment that Yoda came hobbling into the hangar on Geonosis, he would immediately sense the way the room radiated with the dark side right after the battle that had just taken place, and all of the bloodshed. Upon seeing the injured Kenobi and Skywalker laying on the floor, he knew those precise cuts could have only been the handiwork of the blade of Dooku. There was no banter, no witty or reminiscent exchange of dialogue, and Yoda certainly didn't mince words when he said, "The dark side I sense in you." It was from this fateful moment that Yoda may have decided to give Dooku somewhat of a chance, after all the atrocities of the Clone Wars hadn't yet happened, and so Yoda had hope for his fallen student. This would be until their conversation on Vajun in the Legends novel Yoda Dark Rendezvous. Here, Yoda and Dooku met once again and had a lengthy conversation about the Force and their stances within it. This would be a very important conversation, where Yoda finally gave in and showed Dooku what would happen if he were to ever embrace the dark side. During the conversation, Yoda had offered a helping hand to Dooku, expressing that it wasn't too late for him, and he was still welcome back at the Jedi Temple should he ever accept. Yoda expressed that he still cared for Dooku no matter what happened to him, and in this conversation, Yoda actually pours his heart out to Dooku and expresses the love and forgiveness that he will always find at the Grand Master's door. Though of course, Dooku rejects this offer, and it was at some point following this that the two's meeting finally devolved into a duel. My theory is that it is perhaps this moment that Yoda had finally decided that Dooku was too far gone and that he would never change. The dark side corrupts after all, and Yoda knew from repeated historical precedents that once someone starts down this dark path, forever will it dominate their destiny. It is in this duel where Yoda decides that Dooku must die. And at one point, Yoda even says softly, "Love you enough to destroy you, I do." This moment captures Yoda's full mind on the subject. Yoda would rather see Dooku dead than in the hands of the dark side. For Yoda, the dark side came with no mercy, no compromise, no bartering, no negotiations. There was only corruption, hatred, and a will to dominate. The dark side will not be reasoned with, and could only destroy, never create. If one submitted to the dark side, that was it. They were ruined forever, and they had to see destruction in order to understand. Even Yoda's student. Yoda had seen with Jedi such as Sora Bulk, and he knew of stories from the long past of many Jedi going down this dark path and destroying their brothers and sisters. Jedi whom Yoda considered his children. He certainly considered Dooku to be one of his children. Yoda was a near-perfect Jedi, but he did have attachments, an attachment to the Jedi Order. He did not want the power that was granted to him as the head seat on the Council. Yoda curiously stays rather quiet during many council meetings, in fact. It's not the prestige, and maybe it's not even because of their mission of peace. Master Yoda loves the Jedi, and loved Dooku. And what's tragic about this relationship is that Yoda carries weakness in the fact that he loves Dooku, and a weakness that Dooku continues to poke and prod at. For Yoda, the only thing that can destroy a Jedi is a Jedi themselves and their decision to turn. This is why, shockingly, Yoda does want to destroy Dooku and does not hesitate in doing so or stating so in this meeting. But Yoda does not want to destroy Dooku because he's cold-hearted and just wants to vanquish an enemy of the Republic. It's quite the opposite. Remember the Grand Master's quote of the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Yoda perceives killing Dooku as a mercy kill, as the dark side has only brought Dooku, and those steeped within it, suffering. This is a kill done out of mercy. We again see this when Anakin Skywalker falls to the dark side, and he encourages Obi-Wan to go to Mustafar and kill him. He does not even change this stance on his deathbed in Return of the Jedi, as he encourages Luke to destroy Vader. Yoda likely believed that Dooku was already dead, and now it was just his husk, a husk calling itself Darth Tyrannus. To echo what Obi-Wan said, he ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man who was your father was destroyed. But if we change this, and we replace Anakin with Dooku, and Vader with Tyrannus, we now see exactly how Yoda viewed the situation. But anyway, Darth Tyrannus is the undisputed master of the second form of lightsaber combat by the time of the Clone Wars, with a seemingly invincible win record. But despite Dooku's high opinion of his preferred lightsaber form, there was a moment when he was forced to admit its greatest flaw. A shocking moment. Greetings, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. Makashi, also known as Form 2 lightsaber combat, or the Way of the Yassalamari, is the duelist form as many well know. It is perfectly designed for saber-on-saber combat, and when it comes to a single duel, there is simply no better form than Makashi. But as many also know, there are two distinct weaknesses to this form. Firstly, it is designed for a single opponent, and is weak when facing multiple enemies at once. Secondly, it is not optimized for blaster deflection. However, a true master of Makashi can make up for these weaknesses, as Dooku has done time and time again. We have seen Dooku be able to deflect blaster fire with the best of the saber wielders, and Dooku also knows how to isolate his opponents and take them out one by one if he is faced with several attackers. Just look at his duels with Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. However, there is one specific flaw in the Makashi style that Dooku was unable to compensate for, and in the end, it cost him his life. So today, my friends, we open up yet another holocron and analyze the thoughts of Dooku just mere moments before his death. so that we may analyze and discover the final fatal flaw of Makashi. The source we gather from today is The Revenge of the Sith novelization, where we get a view at the duel on the Invisible Hand through the eyes of Count Dooku firsthand. During this fight, Dooku had been tricked by Kenobi and Skywalker, who had actually fought with lightsaber forms that they were subpar at and were not their preferred styles, with Obi-Wan using a Taru and Anakin using Shien. They did this so that they would trick Dooku and lull him into a false sense of security and play on his arrogance, since they were the same forms that they had used against him on Geonosis, and forms that Dooku had subsequently dismantled with ease. This plan actually worked brilliantly, as Tyrannus was throwing them around easily and pretty much mocking them in his own mind. This wasn't until they suddenly changed to their true forms and fought so well that Dooku became terrified. We released a holocron recently talking about this scene where Obi-Wan had put real fear in Dooku for the first time, doing so by displaying his mastery of Form 3 Sarisu. But it was Anakin's use of Form 5 and its variant Gem So that actually forced Dooku into admitting the true weakness of his beloved Makashi. So now, let us read a few key lines from the novelization and analyze them in turn. Skywalker slammed his following strike down so hard that the shock of deflecting it buckled Dooku's elbows. The second strike bent Dooku's wrist. The third flash of blue forced Dooku's scarlet blade so far to the inside that his own lightsaber scorched his shoulder, and Dooku was forced to give ground. Skywalker came on, mechanically inexorable, impossibly powerful, a destroyer droid with a lightsaber. Each step a blow, and each blow a step. Dooku backed away as fast as he dared. Skywalker stayed right on top of him. He no longer tried to block Skywalker's strikes, but only to guide them slanting away. He could not meet Skywalker strength to strength. The boy was a Gem So stylist, and as fine of one as Dooku had ever seen. His own elegant Makashi simply did not generate the kinetic power to meet Gem So head to head. And there it is. Makashi has the ability to cut through almost any other lightsaber form. It is the direct counter to Shi-Cho and Ataru, and can very easily take care of others if the skill of the Form 2 user is good enough. And that is what Form 2 specializes in: skill, and skill alone. However, when it comes to the sheer power of Gem So, Makashi just doesn't have the kind of power to properly meet it head to head. You see, Makashi is much like fencing in that the users often move in a lateral way. The footwork of Makashi is usually front, back, and side to side, and they are often trained to walk along a cross pattern in order to properly lunge into an attack and then quickly retreat. They strike quick and fast like snakes, and can very elegantly maneuver around their opponent when need be. Aggressive and advancing strikes with Makashi rely on the pinpoint accurate blade work rather than physical might. As you see, the footwork and blade work complement each other in that way, and they are measured and balanced. However, with this in mind, it's now understandable how this kind of measured footwork doesn't exactly generate momentum. Let's analyze what Dooku said further. Each step a strike, and each strike a step. We can analyze how Anakin fights both in this duel, as well as his duel with Kenobi on Mustafar. Skywalker is constantly moving forward. His blade motions and his footwork are completely lined up, but in a forward motion like a bulldozer. He doesn't stop moving forward, even when he's defending. The power of Gem So allows the user to invade their opponent's space and force them into a retreat. Makashi has its defensive capabilities for sure, but with its more measured and balanced footwork, it's unable to properly generate the necessary momentum to actually meet Form 5. And this is how Anakin prevailed. Sarisu, interestingly, actually does generate momentum in its own right, as the defensive maneuvers are something that Form 3 practitioners drill themselves on constantly. Many Sarisu sequences work off of the user orbiting their lightsaber to project a field of total defense, an impenetrable wall. Combine this with more circular footwork, and Form 3 is fully capable of keeping up with Gem So. They fit together like perfect puzzle pieces, and this is why Kenobi was able to outlast Skywalker. But Makashi doesn't have these sequences, as it prefers accuracy over power. Not to mention, this is Anakin we are talking about. The amount of physical strength he has is almost impossible for a human, and that is augmented by the Force, which we all know that Anakin has an ample supply of, and we soon get to see the effects that this has on Dooku as the fight wears on. Let us continue. The shining blue lightsaber whirled and spat, and every overhand chop crashed against Dooku's defense with the unstoppable power of a meteor strike. The Sith Lord spent lavishly of his reserve of the Force merely to meet these attacks without being cut in half. And Skywalker was actually getting stronger. Each parry cost Dooku more power than he'd used to throw Kenobi across the room. Each block aged him a decade. The passage would go on to say that Dooku was spending so much Force energy to simply defend against Skywalker that he was actually losing his perception of the room around him, and his senses were beginning to dull. This was the effect that Anakin's Gemso was having on the aged Sith Lord. It was in this single terrifying moment that Dooku realized that he was simply not the best duelist anymore, or at least that the styles no longer matched. This single fatal flaw in his lightsaber form was quickly sapping away his strength, and in a way that he had never dealt with before. And soon, his energy would be drained so far that it left him open to having his hands dismembered. The duel was over.
It is not an overextension to say that Dooku is the best lightsaber duelist or in the top 3 lightsaber duelists in all of Star Wars lore, with the only real competitors to his natural skill with the blade being Yoda, Mace Windu, and Darth Vader. Dooku was an obsessive lightsaber wielder. Having trained many Jedi in the art of lightsaber combat, he was considered the greatest duelist of the era, being a master of Form 2 Makashi. The dueling-centric form, he was essentially the greatest duelist one-on-one that the Jedi had ever seen for that time period, having competed with and even defeated Grandmaster Yoda in various sparring sessions. Darth Sidious even considered Dooku his superior in terms of lightsaber combat, though admittedly, Sidious cared little for skill with the blade. That is why I find Dooku's comments about one General Grievous to be most intriguing, as Dooku's thoughts on General Grievous's lightsaber form are very much a mixed bag, and today we'll discuss why he actually hated Grievous's lightsaber form, as well as why he believed that Grievous was one of the few individuals that could potentially get the better of Dooku in a lightsaber duel. Yes, on one rare occasion near the end of his life, Dooku actually admitted that if Grievous were to get lucky, Grievous could actually have defeated the Count, and today we'll explain why. In all actuality, Dooku found it an absolute pleasure to train General Grievous in lightsaber combat. General Grievous had a partially cybernetic mind that had all 7 forms of lightsaber combat downloaded into it, meaning that he could call upon any form and any variation instantaneously. But what pleased the Count was, despite this huge natural advantage over the Jedi, Dooku still found it highly necessary to train with Dooku and to train on his own. The aggression centers of Grievous's brain were dialed up to a 10 by the droids that reconstructed his body, and Dooku was pleased with how rageful and dangerous Grievous was. He too found a kindred spirit in some sense in General Grievous, as Grievous was just as obsessed with lightsaber combat as Dooku himself was. Despite not being Force sensitive at all, this made Grievous an absolute pleasure to train. General Grievous did not ever coast when it came to his natural skill with the lightsaber, even despite being able to wield 4 lightsabers at once, and he was obsessed with improving his skill to compete with Jedi like Mace Windu and Yoda. Grievous's drive only continued though when Dooku said that he lacked a key component that many Jedi actually had, and why towards the beginning of their training, Count Dooku admitted that Yoda and Mace Windu would have been able to defeat and best Grievous, something that infuriated him coming from his master. Dooku explained that General Grievous lacked all sense of finesse and the greater grace of a lightsaber duel, believing that he relied far too heavily on power strikes and far too heavily on his own physical strength against a Jedi. Despite this massive critique though, this was also General Grievous's greatest advantage against Dooku and the Jedi in general. At various times during their sparring sessions, Grievous would push an advance against Dooku, something that would shock him a great deal and cause him to reflect on his age and the skill of the cybernetic monster, stating that he believed that if General Grievous got lucky and Dooku was not on his best day, that Grievous did have a legitimate chance of besting him. Not only was General Grievous physically imposing, but again he was highly unpredictable due to the cybernetics of his brain and the near endless results of the 7 variations of lightsaber combat. Grievous could be 100% unpredictable in his strikes, never coming at you with the same maneuver or tactic twice. This is something that Dooku found highly impressive and highly dangerous. It was true that General Grievous lacked finesse and the greater strengths that Dooku excelled in, including that of grace and patience.
But where Grievous lacked in these departments, he excelled in nearly every other. In many ways, he was the perfect foil for Dooku. The Jedi had been trained and indoctrinated to be precise, to have finesse, and skill in set variations and styles of lightsaber combat. Therefore, when they were confronted with Grievous, who could change on the dime to any form of lightsaber combat, any technique, any style, they overwhelmed them nearly instantaneously, and the Jedi lost before the duel ever truly began. And this is the same thing that Dooku would experience during sparring sessions. However, Dooku was no fool, and Dooku full well realized that he had to hold certain information and techniques away from Grievous to ensure that if he ever had to, he would have variations of his own form and tricks up his sleeve that would allow him to overcome Grievous in a lightsaber duel, should Grievous and Dooku ever come to blows officially, with neither holding back. Dooku did have tricks up his sleeve that he did not teach Grievous. Not to mention, Dooku was very intelligent in the respect that he always held back in his sparring sessions with Grievous. This kept the general always wondering what Dooku was truly capable of, as Darth Tyrannus made a point never to go all out against General Grievous and constantly keep him wondering. Dooku had to take all of these precautions though, because of the natural power of the general. Admittedly, Dooku hated the way that General Grievous dueled, but he also somewhat admired it, being the exact opposite of his own chosen form. Something that scared Dooku though, deep within himself, is that he knew that General Grievous was designed and had one purpose in his life, that being to dominate and kill Jedi. And Dooku full well knew that he had been a Jedi for nearly 7 decades. He had trained as a Jedi, and he was the exact thing, or at least he used to be the exact thing, that Grievous wanted to kill. This is not to say that if General Grievous and Dooku dueled on even ground, that Dooku would not be the victor 7 or even 8 out of 10 times, as it's clear that Dooku is of course the superior swordsman to Grievous. However, according to Dooku himself, General Grievous was one of the few individuals that he believed could get lucky, and that he believed that should again Dooku not perform his best and Grievous perform his absolute best, that Grievous would have a chance. It's important to note that in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, there is tons of light shed on why Obi-Wan Kenobi was actually finally able to defeat General Grievous. In the novel, Obi-Wan states that he had to give himself over to the Force entirely in order to defeat the general. He states in the novel that it's no longer even him dueling Grievous. Instead, it's the Force itself. And it was only because Obi-Wan had to fall back on something that Grievous had no ability to touch whatsoever that General Grievous finally fell in a lightsaber duel. But anyway,
kill him now. The words that Anakin has secretly been thinking since the very beginning of the Clone Wars. He argues with himself as he stares down at Dooku's helpless expression, while holding the 2 lightsabers crossed in front of his throat, poised for execution. But how did Anakin get here? How exactly did the veteran saber master Count Dooku get bested at his own art by the very Jedi Knight that he had once dismembered? Welcome, curious scholars of the galaxy, to today's video, where we will be breaking down the climactic face-off aboard the Invisible Hand, where the Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus met his fate at the hands of the Chosen One, Anakin Skywalker. In order to fully understand the events of the duel, first we must break down the individual fighting styles and capabilities of Anakin and Dooku respectively. Beginning with Count Dooku, let's analyze the first what he was most known for his lightsaber combat specifically. Dooku was a dueling prodigy during his early training years at the Jedi Temple. He was naturally gifted in the Force, but spent most, if not all of his time honing his skills with blade-to-blade combat, sparring, and practicing for hours on end with the Temple's training bots. Unlike most Jedi, Dooku decided to exclusively specialize in Form 2 lightsaber combat known as Makashi. Makashi was a lightsaber combat form that was specifically tailored for blade-to-blade combat. It was developed during the very early days of the Jedi Order, while it was still in its infancy concerning the blade. In the days of the Ancient Order, there was only one other version of lightsaber combat known as Shi-Cho in practice, which was very basic and involved wide sweeping movements with the blade. When the Great Jedi Schism happened, there was a split in the Jedi Order, where the newly found Dark Jedi ceded and began a war. During this era, a new lightsaber form was founded to combat their saber-wielding opponent, something that had been exceptionally rare in the prior days of the Order.
Now though, they had an enemy that used lightsabers themselves, and therefore, a new lightsaber variant began. Form 2 is very akin to our world's fencing, focusing on lateral movement, precise and graceful blade work, as well as being proficient in taking down single opponents. The form was weakest when facing multiple opponents or against blaster fire. However, this did not outright spell the end for a Makashi master, as a true master of this form would perfect the ability to isolate one's opponents, as we see Dooku do many times with Anakin and Obi-Wan, though this form also lacked the ability to gain momentum during a fight, which makes it weaker to more aggressive fighting styles and variants of lightsaber combat. Still though, in a one-on-one duel, it was nigh insurmountable. Dooku would hone his combat abilities until the point where he was deemed the greatest swordsman of the Jedi Order, even the greatest swordsman of his time. During his time as a Padawan, he was able to pass 2 Jedi Masters in single combat, an event that was exceedingly rare, striking them down and having to be forced to stop. The reason being, he had reason to believe that they were using the dark side, and Dooku wanted an excuse to prove his dominance and destroy them. Following this event, many of the Jedi Masters feared the young Dooku, many except one, Grandmaster Yoda himself. It was practically unheard of for a council member, much less the Jedi Grand Master, to take on a Padawan. This was big news at the time. Yoda would go on to teach Dooku in the ways of the Force, and his powers grew immensely, with Dooku seeing something special in the young boy. It could be said that before Anakin, Dooku was the Anakin of his era. After Dooku left the Jedi Order and embraced the ways of the dark side, his powers skyrocketed to unprecedented levels, so much so in fact that Sidious felt threatened by his very presence. Dooku was not only a master at the blade and adept at the Force, but he was also an expert at the psychological warfare side of blade-to-blade combat, still known as Dun Mak. Dun Mak was a form of combat that focused on instilling distraction and doubt in your opponent, usually by way of insults and belittling. We have seen this succeed multiple times against Obi-Wan, and even Skywalker during their duels in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. During their final duel, Dooku would try this on Anakin and goad him into dipping into the dark side, something that he was unfortunately successful at. Dooku is quite possibly the definitive swordsman of his era. It was said that the only individual that was his equal at the beginning of the Clone Wars was Grandmaster Yoda, and at the end, the only two that stood as his equal were Mace Windu as well as Yoda. Dooku is still considered by many to be the greatest outright swordsman in all of Star Wars, and many believe that he may have weakened at the time in Revenge of the Sith, as the novelization for Revenge of the Sith confirming that Dooku is far from his prime, even explaining that he is tired by the time he is killed by Anakin. Now that we have established Count Dooku, let's move on to Anakin. Anakin Skywalker was a renowned duelist in his own right, with a couple of victories under his belt against Asajj Ventress. Anakin was also a clever and renowned battlefield tactician, despite some of his impulsive tendencies. He led the 501st to many victories during the war, and at a time of Revenge of the Sith, he had widely been regarded by the public as the hero of the Clone Wars and the poster child for the Jedi Order, thanks in part due to the publicity that was orchestrated by Palpatine. Anakin Skywalker was a practitioner of Form 5 lightsaber combat Djem So, and its variant Shien. Form 5 was created by practitioners of Form 3. Form 3 Surisu was solely focused on defense and energy preservation, choosing to outlast an attacker and striking only when an opponent rises in a fatigued state, waiting for the opportune moment. Form 5 practitioners sought to correct the weaknesses seemingly seen in Surisu's sole focus on defense by creating more offense in the way of combat. Djem So was the direct opposite, with its entirety revolving around an overwhelming offense, with its defense mainly consisting of counterattacks, going along with the statement that a best defense is a good offense. Djem So is so aggressive in fact that it is the most physically demanding of all 7 lightsaber forms, even more so than that of a Taru, based on Djem So's emphasis on power strikes. With the Taru, you just had to be quick, but with the Djem So, you had to be quick and strong. Practitioners of Form 5 are usually those of taller stature, with more emphasis on using their muscle mass aided by the Force. But of course, dueling style isn't everything, as Dooku was able to best Anakin on many of their encounters. Anakin may have had Dooku backpedaling for the majority of the fight, but it seemed as though Dooku was more still in control of the duels. It is worth noting that Sidious had told Dooku to take it easy on Anakin, as he wanted to test Skywalker's limits, and then see the Chosen One's power for himself. In all of their duels, Dooku is in fact testing, and in a strange way, teaching Anakin Skywalker. As in every single duel Anakin had with Dooku, he grew in power despite losing all but one. After taking Kenobi out of the picture, Anakin's anger was slowly beginning to be unleashed on the invisible hand. The Count would go on to say, "I sense great fear in you, Skywalker. You have hate, you have anger, but you don't use them." With the Sith Lord poking and prodding, pushing all of Anakin's buttons, finally, the young Jedi Knight gave in to the allure of the dark side. For even just a moment, he unleashed his fury on Darth Tyrannus, and Dooku was unprepared for the well of power within the young boy. Dooku was forced into a position that he did not want to be in the defense, no longer taking it easy and finding himself in a fight for his life. Anakin, though, had gone into a calculated rage, battering his opponent's defenses away with measured ferocity. As we mentioned before, Makashi has a hard time generating momentum, which happens to be something that Djemso is very good at, meaning that the two lightsaber styles do not actually match up. And though on the surface you would say that Makashi would have the advantage here, the second a practitioner of Djemso gains this momentum, the fight is over. Anakin calculatedly beat down the Count's wall of defense before finally taking advantage of the opening and exacting his revenge by taking double of what the Count had once taken from him, his hands. And now, here we are again, Dooku on his knees at the mercy of the budding Vader, with Palpatine praising him from the side and urging for the Sith Lord's execution. Anakin at this point still believes in the virtues of the Republic and the Jedi way, so he doubts himself for a moment. Palpatine, however, sensed how much he desired to take revenge for what Dooku had done to him and all the horrors that Tyrannus had turned loose on the galaxy during the war. So, all it took was two simple yet effective words: do it. And with that, Count Dooku was no more. The whole plan of Palpatine being kidnapped was also that he could lure Anakin there so that he could see his true power in person. It was also an underhanded attempt to get rid of Dooku, because as stated before, Sidious was threatened by him and his rising power. He needed a quick way to dispose of him so that he could make room for his new and more powerful apprentice. So my friends, what do you think of Why was Dooku filled with such terror when Anakin Skywalker removed both of his hands during their climactic duel in Revenge of the Sith? A reaction not purely out of pain, but something else entirely that we will be breaking down today, with Anakin doing this shocking Dooku to his core for a very specific reason that is ingrained in the Count himself. Greetings, acolytes of the Force and students of the galaxy, and welcome back to our archives. Today, we will be analyzing the deeper subtext in the final duel between Dooku and Anakin Skywalker, one of the greatest rivalries in all of Star Wars lore, and certainly the most heated rivalry over the Clone Wars. In many ways, Dooku was the one that shaped Anakin Skywalker into the man and fighter that he would become, perhaps even being a better teacher to Anakin through trial by fire than his own master Obi-Wan Kenobi. But there is something important about their final interaction, and Anakin severing both of Dooku's hands that means way more than meets the eye. So today, we will be opening up that holocron. Obviously in Star Wars lore, when an individual loses a hand, it is not a pleasant experience at all, from Luke Skywalker to Mace Windu. But again, there is something specific about when Dooku loses his hand, and in his face, you see not pain, but pure and utter horror and shock. The reason for this speaks solely to Dooku's arrogance. In Legends continuity, thanks to the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which is one of the greatest Star Wars novels out there by the way. In the moments right before Dooku faces down Anakin Skywalker, Dooku makes the case for why Anakin should not be turned to the dark side, and in fact even proposes that they attempt to turn Obi-Wan instead of the young Skywalker. Dooku states several reasons for why Anakin should not be selected and should not be turned, stating that while Anakin Skywalker is clearly the more powerful of the two, he is also uncontrollable, with this speaking to Dooku's high opinion of Qui-Gon Jinn, and that being shared with Obi-Wan Kenobi. In a way, Dooku believed that Obi-Wan was a sort of grandson, and in stark contrast to this, there was something about Anakin Skywalker that Dooku was repulsed by, and that was in fact his cybernetic arm. In the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, it is explained that Dooku is extremely arrogant and massively elitist, and at several points throughout Legends continuity, he is absolutely repulsed by cybernetics. He is repulsed by General Grievous, but with Anakin Skywalker, it is far more personal. It could be said that Dooku is highly jealous of Anakin, but also believes to his very core that he is more powerful, and that he does not want Anakin Skywalker to join the ranks of the Sith and become a true rival like Sidious desires. Instead, he points points to Anakin Skywalker's cybernetic arm as one of the major reasons why he should not be turned, stating that Anakin had no taste, and that if Dooku had lost a hand, that he would have learned to use his lightsaber with only a single arm. Dooku even pointed out that it was he who took the arm from Anakin Skywalker in the first place, and with Anakin deciding to replace it with a cybernetic arm, Dooku viewed this as the ultimate insult. He viewed this as no longer being a gentleman and cutting corners, something that Dooku prided himself on never doing. However, Darth Sidious's response to this is actually quite brilliant, as Sidious even makes a very good case that Anakin Skywalker losing his arm could work in their advantage. This all stems back to Sidious's original plan for Anakin if he had not been burned on Mustafar. It was Sidious's original plan to have Anakin Skywalker be the golden boy of a newfound empire, a hero of the Clone Wars, as Darth Sidious made it one of his major goals to let the legend of Anakin Skywalker and the Valiant Warrior permeate throughout the galaxy in the Clone Wars itself. In fact, he was going to use Anakin Skywalker as the individual that would transition the Republic and the fall of the Jedi into the Empire, as if he could get Anakin to publicly state that the Jedi were traitors, then he would have the entire galaxy eating out of his palm. Of course, this would not be the case in the end, but Darth Sidious made an interesting point considering the cybernetic arm of Anakin. As Sidious stated, this represented Anakin Skywalker's willingness to make sacrifices, and was a physical representation of his heroism during the Clone Wars. Thinking about this on a larger scale, we really get the idea that Anakin Skywalker truly was to inherit the Empire and the Sith one day. And this also goes to show why Darth Sidious was so angered by Anakin's defeat on Mustafar. Anakin truly was the key to everything. Of course, in the end, Dooku would lose this argument, but it also goes to show just why he was so horrified when Anakin Skywalker took his hands. When this happens, Dooku finds himself at a crossroads. He will either have to give up his elitist nature and get two cybernetic hands, giving up his distinguished taste, or he will be forced to never wield a lightsaber for the rest of his life. Dooku's defining feature. Dooku loved the Force and he loved the study of the dark side itself. But this is not where Dooku found pure joy. In fact, he and Anakin could be kindred spirits in this regard. Both of them were truly passionate about lightsaber combat, and it is this realization, not simply the pain, which is why Dooku is so terrified in this moment. He will either have to condemn himself to a lesser life, considered himself a cyborg and a lesser being, or he will never touch the weapon that has brought him such joy ever again. This also speaks to the arrogance of Dooku though, as instead of fearing for his life in this moment, he is fearing for his future. And it is not until his own master in Darth Sidious tells Anakin to kill the injured Sith Lord that he truly realizes the gravity of this failure, and the gravity of the deception of his master. The Revenge of the Sith novelization goes such a long way to illustrate Dooku as a character, and just how selfish of a man he truly is. Even after Anakin Skywalker removes both of his hands, a disgusting final moment to an individual that very much Dooku has grown to hate, he still believes that he will be spared. In the end, it isn't until his very final moment that Dooku even fears for his life. He is in complete and utter fear for his future. He will have to go down to the level of the General Grievuses and the Anakin Skywalkers. And what makes this even more appalling and insulting, in just moments earlier, Dooku was discussing how this repulsed him about Anakin. Dooku was never intended to be made out as a hero of the Clone Wars. In fact, he was going to be openly forgiven by Anakin, or at least that's what Dooku thought. With the transition of the Separatists and the Republic coming together in the forms of Anakin and Dooku making peace. But the loss of Dooku's hands would not pose him as a hero of the Clone Wars. He was always meant to be the villain, and he and the galaxy would perceive the loss of his hands as that fact. He would not be able to have it with pride as Anakin did. And in this way, perhaps Dooku even wanted to die, and perhaps this represented a far worse outcome than the Chosen One killing him. Dooku's downfall has always been his elitism, as well as his pride. It couldn't be worse that his greatest rival, and one of the men that he hated the most, beat him at the thing that he prided himself in, but that he also brought him down to a level that for years Dooku believed he was above. And in a twisted way, this is one of the most tragic final moments to a character in all of Star Wars lore. But now, my friends,
among the Jedi, Dooku was already considered to be a formidable fighter and very powerful in the Force. But as a Sith, he reached levels of power that had never been seen in all the years of his life. As an older man, Dooku accepted the ways of the dark side,
and because of it, he actually became a match for his old master in Yoda, specifically with the lightsaber, and became so powerful that even Sidious was becoming jealous and wary of him. In the Clone Wars series, as well as in the comics, we often see how powerful and ruthless Dooku is. There is no one who can stand against him. Even when 3 Night Sisters attack him while invisible, plus Dooku being poisoned, he still managed to defeat all of them without so much as suffering a scratch. But yet, when we see this man again in Revenge of the Sith, he looks tired and weak. In the novelization, his age is put at the forefront of the page, and it is mentioned several times that he is being weakened because of his physical age. But is that all there is to it? Dooku may have been 83 in Revenge of the Sith, but that means he was already 80 at the start of the Clone War. So what happened to Dooku? Why was it that he was so weak after only 3 years of wielding the dark side and 3 years of war? Well, my acolytes, it's time to open up yet another holocron and discover the truth of what really happened to Count Dooku. At first, we need to be clear. When we say Dooku is weak, we do not mean weak overall, but simply weaker in comparison to his previous version. Now, there is something to be said about an older Force wielder not being able to accomplish the same feats as their younger selves. This, of course, is a given. We know it happens to Sidious even when he is 87 in Return of the Jedi, and we saw it happen to Qui-Gon Jinn in his 60s. Qui-Gon, who got tired out pretty quickly after a brief duel with Maul, not to mention having to adjust his lightsaber form to accommodate for his advanced age. Even Yoda, as powerful and as hardened as he is, doesn't sustain fights for very long, and instead produces a volley of attacks or force feats before being tuckered out. However, it needs to be restated that we didn't see this kind of weakness from Dooku only a couple of years prior to Revenge of the Sith. In fact, according to the timeline of events, Dooku's duel with Anakin and Obi-Wan on Obadiah only happened around a year prior to the duel on the Invisible Hand. But let's examine the duel on Obadiah first. Here, we can see Dooku manhandling the 2 Jedi with relative ease, only now beginning to have trouble with Skywalker's growing abilities. In this duel, Dooku moves like a dancer, even employing acrobatics in his fighting form, which is completely foreign to the traditional form of Makashi, leading us to theorize that Dooku has achieved a version of Makashi far beyond anybody else. Following the duel, if Dooku is tired at all, he doesn't show it, and only retreats whenever the Pikes begin to fire upon him. If the Pikes had not arrived, it's completely reasonable that he could have taken Obi-Wan and Anakin at once. In another powerful feat of combat ability, Dooku takes on Savage and Ventress at the same time, only being overpowered by the growing rage of Savage Opress, who was using the pain Dooku inflicted on him as pure dark side adrenaline. And even as powerful as Savage was, Dooku kept him neutralized with Force Lightning for the majority of the fight, with Savage even calling him too powerful. And then, Dooku would be poisoned by the Night Sisters, invisible Night Sisters, his senses dulled. Here, not only did Dooku fend off 3 attackers at once, and it should be stated that Makashi is notoriously weak on multiple opponents, something that Ventress knew, but Dooku in this engagement didn't suffer a single injury. He levitated 3 Night Sisters into the air, and poured his absolute hatred into them in the form of Force Lightning. Let's not also forget that Dooku defeated Ventress a final time in the novel Dark Disciple, while at the same time defeating the Jedi Master Quinlan Vos, and this only happened a few months prior to the Battle of Coruscant and his final duel with Skywalker. The point we're illustrating is Dooku was plenty powerful during the Clone Wars and was very close to being indomitable completely. Perhaps only Yoda and Sidious were the real rivals to Dooku in his prime. But of course, there are several times where we see Dooku struggling against Skywalker's power specifically. He defeats Anakin almost every time during the Clone Wars, but it slowly becomes more and more difficult and clear that he is becoming outmatched. Their duel on Naboo is the closest that Anakin gets to actually defeating Dooku one-on-one. He beat Dooku down on the stairs in front of the Chancellor, and it was only due to Dooku's superior powers in the dark side that he was able to outdo the younger Jedi. On Obadiah, it is visually implied that ironically, it was Obi-Wan who was holding Anakin back in this fight. Dooku kept putting Obi-Wan in danger, forcing Anakin to break his concentration in order to save his master. In fact, on this duel, it is one of the few times where Anakin is not outright defeated by Dooku. This would be their final duel before the Invisible Hand. And now, we have seen Anakin Skywalker's power eclipse Dooku as he grew more and more skilled, talented, and focused after every clash of the blade. In the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, it describes Anakin's blows as unstoppable and overpowering. It explains that Dooku is feeling every single moment of his 83 years, and in this iconic line, every strike from Anakin was aging him a decade. It explains that Dooku has to spend lavishly on his force reserves just to block the young Skywalker's strikes, and soon he has to stop blocking them head on and simply direct them away from him as Skywalker's power becomes too much for the aged Sith. It's astonishing how powerful Skywalker has become, especially from Dooku's perspective. The Count is terrified for his life, and the novel explains it. With that said, many would say it was not Dooku's weakness, but Anakin's strength that won the day. However, this is not entirely true. Dooku wasn't what he once was as a young man, as the Attack of the Clones and Tales of the Jedi Dooku would have been a better match for Skywalker in this moment. It's also important to mention that in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, it's revealed that Dooku becomes terrified not only of Skywalker, but Kenobi as well, realizing that his version of Sarisu is so fast and so impenetrable, and this is why Dooku decided to use the Force against Kenobi, giving up on blade-to-blade combat, a rarity to be sure. So now, what happened to Dooku? Why is this man on the Invisible Hand so different from his previous version? The entire problem lies in the secret weakness to the dark side itself, the thing which grants instantaneous power, but at a terrible, corruptible price. The price is alluded to, but never spoken of. Physical scarring is the only surface level problems that come from the dark side toll on one's body. As Mace Windu put it is a torch that burns bright, but quickly burns out. Even Sidious himself commented on it. The dark side ravages the flesh. I believe I might sustain my life only by transferring it to a younger body of a cloned host. Decades of wielding such power will leave one a deflated husk. We just haven't yet seen anyone get to that point yet, besides Sidious. Not to mention that many Sith die prematurely. But the Sith are well aware of these deformities and embrace it. One Sith during the Old Republic, named Lord Scourge, was shocked and even disgusted at the sight of a Sith sorceress named Darth Nihilus. Despite her actually being a young woman, she was so disfigured that he found it difficult to even look upon her. And although she was powerful in the Force, she ultimately turned out to be far too physically weak to properly protect herself when Revan used her own Force lightning against her, a moment that disintegrated her instantly. All of this is a direct dichotomy to the gifts of the light, which provides a slower and more steady stream of power, but will sustain one for much longer. But why did the darkness affect Dooku so quickly? Well, there are two reasons. The first reason has to do with the Clone Wars itself. Dooku was under constant stress, more stress than he ever had to deal with as a Jedi. The emotional and physical toll it took for someone of his age to be fighting as ferociously as he was dealing with all of the galactic war on top of it. This began to deteriorate his form. Stress takes a larger physical toll on people than most realize, and it can absolutely break someone down in a matter of months. Because Dooku was so old and joined the dark side so late, his body hadn't properly adjusted to this new amount of power output. Dooku was one of the few who has been a Jedi his entire life, before ultimately suddenly switching to the darkness, a fact that is not healthy on the body. A body which has been used and has grown used to the invigorating nature of the light side, and having that suddenly stripped away, and in its place, the deteriorating powers of the dark. Dooku was old, and physically he was going downhill, but the light had been sustaining him all this time. Just look at him in Tales of the Jedi compared to his appearances in Attack of the Clones. When the dark side took over, it rapidly advanced his age. He was unfamiliar with the power output and all of the physically demanding tasks he was performing, and it is for this reason why Dooku was severely weakened, especially at the conclusion of the Clone Wars. This toll of the dark side is far too understated. As much power as Sidious held in Return of the Jedi, he had to use a cane. The dark side is a curse, an illness, and it took the very life essence from Dooku. But anyway, my friends, Acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. Count Dooku is an extremely complex character who has received a whole lot more characterization in recent years, especially with his 3 episodes in Tales of the Jedi. Despite him being one of the main antagonists for the Clone Wars, there has always been more to Dooku than meets the eye. He was once a Jedi trained under Grandmaster Yoda, and the one who would go on to mentor Qui-Gon Jinn, a man who went down as one of the greatest and most enlightened Jedi in history. Dooku always cared very deeply for Qui-Gon, and it was his death that sent Dooku into a spiral of becoming Darth Tyrannus. Despite being a Sith Lord, however, Dooku still exhibited several traits that some might consider to be redeemable. One of these is his underlying affection for one Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is a topic that we have touched on once before, but in this holocron, we have new information that we thought was very relevant, which presents Dooku's cares for Obi-Wan out in the open by word of his own mouth, as Dooku finally explains why he cares so deeply about Obi-Wan. Our source today comes from the Revenge of the Sith novelization, and my friends, we are quite excited to share what we have found. So without further ado, let's explain why Dooku had such a soft spot for Kenobi. The text we are pulling from comes out of a conversation between Sidious and Dooku aboard the Invisible Hand during the Battle of Coruscant. We talked about how this conversation a few holocrons earlier when we referenced how Sidious stated that he actually loved Anakin's mechanical arm. Well, in this same conversation, the two Sith Lords were discussing their plan once more right before the two Jedi entered to rescue the Chancellor. Palpatine had already decided that he wanted Dooku to kill Obi-Wan in an effort to drive Anakin further into the dark side, thus assuring their total victory. However, Dooku once more shows a tiny little ray of light within as he pleads one more time for Obi-Wan's life. Their conversation goes like this. Dooku says, "May I suggest, Master, that we give Kenobi one last chance? The support of a Jedi with his integrity would be invaluable in establishing the political legitimacy of our new empire." Sidious responds with a gentle tone, calling out what he knew to be true. "Ah yes, Kenobi. You have long been interested in Kenobi, haven't you?" It's there that Dooku finally admits in his own words how he actually feels about the Jedi Master. Of course, his master was my Padawan. In a sense, he's practically my grandson. Tyrannus here finally shows a crack in his shell of darkness, revealing the final attachment which he has for Obi-Wan. We actually get straight from Dooku himself how he really feels, putting aside all the pretense for once, which goes to show just how he actually cared for Kenobi. The fact that Dooku was willing to go for bat for Obi-Wan, even to Darth Sidious. This isn't the first time that we've seen Dooku do such a thing either, as he has defended Ventress to Sidious after he was told to kill her. Back then, Sidious put Dooku in his place with a forced choke. But here, it goes much differently, as Dooku approaches the conversation from a much more humble standpoint, conceding to Palpatine having learned from the last time. Sidious cuts Dooku off mid-sentence when he compares Obi-Wan to his grandson, and Sidious says this: "He is too old, too indoctrinated, irretrievably poisoned by the Jedi fable. We established that on Geonosis, did we not? In his mind, he serves the Force itself. Reality is nothing in the face of such conviction. Kenobi must die, today, at your hand. His death may be the code key of the final lock that will seal Skywalker to us forever." Again, Dooku just agrees with his master and makes no more commentary on the subject, but he shows that he is still very uncomfortable with the idea that he has to kill Kenobi. I have to say that I really like getting into these interactions and seeing them unfold. Dooku is one who usually plays his cards pretty close to the chest, but actually chooses very specific times in which to reveal vital information so that he can manipulate the people around him. This was one time where he actually let it slip and made the mistake of showing his vulnerability around Sidious. Dooku deeply cares for Obi-Wan because, as he once said, Obi-Wan is basically the last remaining memory of Qui-Gon Jinn, and is the living representation of all the good things that Dooku managed to accomplish as a Jedi Master. Let's go even further into this for just a moment. In a holocron we submitted to you all the other day, we talked about why exactly Dooku despises Anakin. The fact that Anakin reminds Dooku so much of himself as a young man and as a Jedi. Anakin is the living representation of all of Dooku's failure and betrayals, which is why Dooku hates Anakin so much. But then we have Obi-Wan, a strong and a dedicated Jedi, once who learned at the feet of Qui-Gon and went on to become one of the greatest Jedi of the entire order, achieving even a seat on the Jedi High Council by Revenge of the Sith. I can imagine there is a part of Dooku that is actually impressed and even proud of Obi-Wan, a part of Dooku that still lives as a Jedi, and takes pleasure in the fact that Obi-Wan is still a living member of Dooku's Jedi lineage. Obi-Wan wasn't bested by Maul or anything in this war, but still kept coming again and again, proving his mettle to Dooku more times than anyone else on the Council, or even in the whole Jedi Order. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Obi-Wan Kenobi may be the only Jedi in the entire Order, including Yoda, that Dooku fully respects and here he is faced with the ultimate choice: to kill him, and by virtue, kill his past self and Qui-Gon indefinitely, or be forced to bargain for his life. I think Sidious actually picked up on all of this. You see, the reason why I love this interaction is because of all of the subtext. For Sidious, he needs Obi-Wan to die so that Anakin will turn. However, he also needs Obi-Wan to die, possibly to test the loyalty of Dooku. Sidious clearly knows what Obi-Wan means to Dooku, as he even points out that Dooku has been quite interested in Kenobi ever since he turned to the dark side. Sidious even makes a point to remind Dooku that he already attempted to turn Kenobi once on Geonosis and failed. But the fact that Dooku again returned and bargained for Obi-Wan's life really tipped Sidious off to the fact that Dooku still had a Jedi attachment. One last final weakness that he had not weeded out. And of course, this was not acceptable. While I believe it was Sidious's plan to kill Dooku the entire time, I cannot help but wonder if Sidious's decision to have Dooku die was reinforced by the fact that Dooku defied his orders and spared Obi-Wan during their duel. If we look at the duel itself, Dooku had lifted Obi-Wan by his throat and kicked Anakin away. It would have been nothing to make Anakin watch as he ran Obi-Wan through with Dooku's lightsaber, while the Jedi Master was helplessly suspended in the air. However, Dooku did not kill Obi-Wan, instead fleeing him off the balcony and trapping him under a walkway. We can even see Sidious's expression when Dooku does this. He looks pained, confused, and disappointed. His eye then flicks to Dooku. I firmly believe that he was furious that Tyrannus did not finish Kenobi when he should have. Dooku clearly knew what he was doing, and know that Obi-Wan would survive, which of course he did. This is why Palpatine tried to get Anakin to leave Obi-Wan there, as he knew the Jedi Master would have survived that attack with little more than a concussion. Force sensitives are incredibly durable, as force-reinforced physical bodies allow them to survive a great deal of blunt force trauma. If Dooku wanted to secure Kenobi's death, then he would have ran him through with the lightsaber. I believe that when the time actually came, Dooku did not have it in him. He couldn't kill what remained of Qui-Gon Jinn, or he would have been no better than Darth Maul. And this is why Dooku has a real soft spot, and a weakness even, for Obi-Wan. This was one of the defining moments where Dooku decided to defy Darth Sidious, and it infuriated him, made his blood boil, and Sidious knew that Dooku would never leave that room. Though it's information that we always suspected, it was beautiful that we actually got a confirmation in the Revenge of the Sith novel about how Dooku really cared for Kenobi. But what are your thoughts on all of this? Do you think Dooku spared Obi-Wan on purpose, or do you think that this was a coincidence? Let us know your thoughts down below. And as always, thank you so much for visiting the channel today and for your support. May the Force be with you. In Revenge of the Sith aboard the Invisible Hand, Anakin stood triumphant over Count Dooku, his rival, twin lightsabers poised across his throat. In a moment, Anakin would commit an act that would alter his destiny forever. But there was a long moment there during Anakin's initial hesitation, a moment where he had not yet given to the allure of the dark side. While his revenge was nigh, he was still somewhat wanting to believe in the Jedi path. During this time, Dooku could have changed the course of history by revealing the truth. He had alluded this to Obi-Wan on Geonosis, that a Sith Lord had in fact infiltrated the Galactic Senate and was controlling them from the inside. At any point during the Clone Wars, Dooku could have told Anakin the same thing. But yet, even when Palpatine had betrayed Dooku, the Count could have gotten him back right then and there by again spilling everything and revealing the plan of the Sith to the Chosen One. But he didn't. So why is this? It is a question that many have asked in the past, and here, today, we are going to hopefully answer it. First though, we are still looking for a brand new editor on the YouTube channel, so if you have experience with video editing and are as big a fan of Star Wars as I am, please reach out. Again, this is a paid position. The best way to reach me is using the email in the description down below. Anyway, my friends, let us begin with the lore. Before we answer exactly why Dooku did not reveal the plan of the Sith to Anakin in his dying moments, it's important to note one thing that will be the defining factor to answering this question. Count Dooku essentially became Sidious's right-hand man during the entirety of the Clone War. For 3 years, Dooku was one of the only Separatist leaders and Sith underlings that actually knew of Sidious's double life as the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. Darth Sidious was more open with Dooku about all of his plans than anyone else in the galaxy, except the whole thing was a deception. You see, Sidious was honest with Dooku if only to just play him for a fool by lulling him into a false sense of security, and in feeling like he was a fellow conspirator alongside the Dark Lord. Sidious allowed Dooku to think of himself as one of the coming rulers of this new empire that was on the rise. Sidious also fed Dooku's ideas by promising to make him the commander over an Imperial army. Dooku knew almost everything. As he saw in Attack of the Clones, he was privy not only to Sidious's true identity, but also the Death Star plans. In short, Count Dooku made the fatal mistake of trusting Sidious, and believing that he had Sidious's trust in return. He did, in a way though. Sidious trusted Dooku to act just as he did through the war, and whilst grooming Anakin for the true position of his apprentice. Darth Sidious's manipulation of Dooku ran deep. So deep in fact that he let Dooku in on other plans, such as the plan to turn Skywalker to the dark side, though Dooku didn't know that Anakin would ultimately be his replacement, believing that Anakin was to simply be an addition. Right before the duel on the Invisible Hand, just minutes before Anakin and Obi-Wan burst onto the command bridge to rescue the Chancellor, Palpatine and Dooku are having a conversation, and Dooku is reveling in the moment that is about to happen. He congratulated Sidious on all of his machinations finally coming to fruition. The plan was to kill Obi-Wan and officially get him out of the way so that Dooku could then focus on simply goading Anakin into embracing the dark side in order to defeat him. Sidious strictly instructed Tyrannus to take it easy on Anakin so Palpatine could observe the young Jedi's fury firsthand. He didn't want Anakin to be dispatched so easily, of course. The two went over the plan over and over again, which initially was Dooku would duel the two Jedi and kill Obi-Wan in order to goad Anakin into using the dark side. After Sidious had seen enough, and Dooku was to surrender to Anakin and allow himself to be taken into custody, setting in motion the plans for the future. However, as you know, these events did not play out as Dooku was promised. The duel took place and was all going well until Dooku failed to actually kill Obi-Wan in a definitive manner. He had lifted Kenobi into the air by the throat and could have easily stabbed him right through then and there. But instead, Dooku decided not to. Instead, he opted to fling the Jedi Master into the railing and simply incapacitate him. A quick side note here. You can see that Palpatine is not happy with this turn of events as we immediately see a rather pained look on his face. We see this quite clearly when he glances over at Obi-Wan's unconscious body and then back at Dooku. In this moment, Sidious is not playing the persona of the Chancellor, as none of the people present are looking or even thinking to sense Sidious. This painted expression, in my opinion, was his confusion and disappointment that Dooku did not kill Kenobi. Their entire plan hinged on Obi-Wan dying so that Anakin would have no more ties to the light. And now, Dooku was risking the success of that plan, all to preserve Obi-Wan, if not subtly. Their entire plan hinged on Obi-Wan dying so that Anakin would have no more ties to the light. I have a personal theory as to why Dooku didn't kill Obi-Wan here. We already know that Dooku was against killing any Jedi during the entirety of the Clone Wars, as Dooku didn't want to simply slay his brothers and sisters. Dooku believed that the Jedi had already sacrificed enough of their ranks for political reasons, and didn't want to contribute the Jedi casualties directly during the war. We also know that Dooku and Obi-Wan may have a soft spot for one another despite being on opposite ends. The two shared a moment in Attack of the Clones where Dooku was prepared to betray his master in order to get Obi-Wan to join him. Even in their final duel, Dooku only did enough to injure the two Jedi, but not kill them. I think that when it came down to it, there was a part of Dooku that simply couldn't do it. Even moments earlier, he had advocated for Obi-Wan to be turned to the dark side, and not Anakin. Despite all the darkness, he couldn't bring himself to coldly murder Obi-Wan, the very last remnant of Qui-Gon Jinn, and in a sense, his very grandson. Instead, he bet it all by just knocking him out of the conflict and using Dun Mok to lure Anakin to the dark side. This compromise might be what cost him his life in the end, or at least what cost him his life much sooner. Anyway, back to the duel itself. Anakin successfully unleashed his darkness and takes from Dooku twice what he took from him, and then had him at blade point. So this is where all the information we have gathered comes full circle. Dooku's silence was a threefold. First, he was shocked at Anakin's sheer power in the dark side, and the fact that he wasn't even slightly prepared for it, and it cost him both of his hands. The things that he spent his entire life honing to perfection with his skill in the lightsaber. Secondly, he was far too stunned to speak that the Chancellor could tell Anakin to kill him. Obviously, this is the moment where he should spill all the secrets. But lastly, and most importantly, Dooku still thought that this was all going according to plan. He wasn't told how he was going to be captured, just that he was going to be captured. He thought that anything would happen that would prevent his death in this moment, so he stayed silent and loyal until his very last. However, you can see it in his eyes the moment before his death where he senses the shift in the Force. The shift within Anakin. This very shift let him know that his death was imminent. However, before he could get a word out, his head was already on the floor. So here's the thing. Do I think that Palpatine was going to let Dooku live if he had gone through and killed Obi-Wan? Well, I'm not sure. However, I do believe that he would have dispatched Dooku eventually. I think that Dooku's death was planned from the start, and Palpatine wanted Anakin to be pushed over the edge so that he could give in and kill an unarmed prisoner. Despite this though, I can't help but feel that Dooku's failure to kill Obi-Wan was an inconvenience to Sidious at best, and a massive game changer at worst. And of course, it could turn out to be the latter on Mustafar, with Obi-Wan not being taken out, and Obi-Wan given the opportunity to triumph over Anakin, robbing Sidious of his true prize. Well friends, what do you think of this? Was this the explanation that you were looking for here in our archives? One more interesting fact I want to put in here is that both in the original script for Revenge of the Sith, as well as in the novelization, Dooku grovels to Sidious and begs for his life. However, during filming, Sir Christopher Lee told Lucas that he didn't think it was becoming of the character to beg for his life, and as it sort of went against what Count Dooku was all about. Anyway, my friends, if you like this video and want to see more content like this, be sure to comment down below and let us know a topic that you would like to see us explore. Again, be sure to reach out using the email in the description down below if you're interested in the editing position. Anyway, my friends, thank you so much for watching. May the Force be with you, and I will hopefully see you in a later video.